Let's get the week started right with the Countdown to Classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Each week we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated World of Warcraft Classic. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and as you all know by now, this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on everything relating to the sure-to-be amazing World of Warcraft Classic. Today, we're kicking off interview week on the show, as I promised last week that we'd be pushing out a whole bunch of interviews and calls that I've been sitting on for about the past 3 weeks or so. So apologies to all of you waiting patiently for another lore or forums episode. They will definitely come again, just not this week. Now, please do stick around after each interview this week, as every episode will also feature some calls after the featured discussion. And all of these are just as interesting as the bigger calls. They're just a little shorter in length, as I can't chat to everyone for nearly 2 hours each, even though I'd really love to. I would highly recommend sticking around for today's call after the interview, which is with a game developer / designer of a very well-known game, which we can't name for privacy reasons, but it was a really interesting chat, as they all are. So I really hope you stick around all week for those after the interviews each episode. So why is it all interviews this week? Well, pumping these calls out this week will help alleviate the interview bottleneck that's going on at the moment. But that's an amazing position to be in, as the queue to call in to Countdown to Classic has started to stretch around the block, as more and more of you are taking me up on the open invitation to anyone who has veteran knowledge, amazing insight, or just a fun story about World of Warcraft to come and chat about it here for the thousands of listeners enjoying the show worldwide. So we'll kick off interview week with this in-depth discussion all about one of the most popular classes in vanilla World of Warcraft, and one that you may well be considering rolling for Classic: mages. And to help explain some of the intricacies of the class, I was fortunate enough to have hardcore raider North approach me, volunteering as tribute for these mighty wielders of frost, fire, and the arcane arts. Now, if you're a fan of the show and you'd like the chance to voice your opinion about vanilla World of Warcraft to the world via a quick call on the show, then please do reach out to me via the show's amazing Discord, or on Twitter at Counts2Classic with the number 2, or email me at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com. You'll find all those links in the show notes for each episode. But for now, let's get into this interview with North, all about mages in vanilla World of Warcraft. Hello, and a huge Countdown to Classic welcome to North. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
My absolute pleasure. So thank you so much for putting your hand up to come on the show. Just to let everyone know how I came across you, I've obviously been asking recently for people who are incredibly knowledgeable about a certain class or spec within the game to shout out to me, as I've been looking to take these interviews towards the class side of things from time to time. And you came forward recently to me, happy to nominate yourself as a bit of a mage veteran. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, so as we do here on Countdown to Classic during these interviews, let's tear through your WoW resume and let people know a little bit about you and your experience with the game. So you ready for a few questions?
Give them as they come. Let's go.
Okay, question number 1. With as much specificity as you're comfortable with, where in the world are you from?
So I'm from the East Coast of the U.S.
And how long have you played World of Warcraft?
I have been playing that's actually a fantastic question. I think 12 or so years, maybe 11. I've been playing since so I'm 22 now, and I started playing when I was 9, so around 12 years, I'd say.
Wow. Side question, 9 years old when you started. How would you describe your grasp of the game when you kicked off?
Well, it actually wasn't even my first MMO when I started playing. I had played, my dad got me into EverQuest 2 and Guild Wars at the time. So I'd been playing for a while, but they didn't really appeal to me. They were sort of the old era of more hardcore MMO, and the graphics weren't as appealing, whereas World of Warcraft, had the sort of cartoony style that appealed to a 9-year-old me a lot more. And, ever since then, it's probably my favorite game of all time. So I've been playing it since.
So did you start up with MMOs as early as about 7 years old or something?
Yeah.
Wow, that's definitely something. We might get back to that later. I do enjoy asking people about that. Okay, what was your original main character's name in the game?
My main character's name was actually North E, because North was taken. So I picked North E. I really wanted, I believe it was a family friend who was playing. She was one of my best friend's sister. She named her Warlock Southie, and I was like, oh, Southie, I like the name North. I tried to pick North. North wasn't available, so I figured I'd copy her. And I was Northie, the female gnome rogue,
now,
as it were.
Well, now, if you're going for North when Classic drops, you're probably going to be competing with Kanye's kid for that name.
Yeah, no, a couple of people have definitely asked if it was referenced to that on Elysium, last private server I played on, before it became Lightbringer, I think, under Light's Hope. Mm-hmm. I went by Northwest because someone took North, and so everyone thought it was Kanye's kid reference, but I was just trying to pick a cardinal direction.
Okay. Now, what was your main character's class and race?
Yeah, so my main character back in the day, and for most of my retail experience, was actually a rogue, a gnome rogue. But I always had an alt since vanilla, although I only got it to high 50s actually in vanilla itself. But that was another gnome mage.
And what other classes have you hit a level cap with?
So other than that, to be honest, not counting random retail expansions where you can just get level cap instantly, I think Warlock, Rogue, and Mage. So I think most people would probably hate my guts.
And which server did you play on when you started?
So I played on Bailgun in the US servers.
And do you prefer to play on PvP or PvE servers?
I prefer to play on PvP servers. When I was a kid, the people we were rolling with, I think it was my dad who chose a server, because we all rolled in the same server. It was cute. We played in a PvE server, which I thought I wanted back at the time, because I was like, oh, I don't want to get ganked and randomly doing things, but now I'm very much a PvP server buff. Really think that the game should be, especially in vanilla, played from a PvP server's perspective.
Okay, sorry, so I might have missed this. You said we all played. Was the whole family playing the game?
Yeah, actually, and our family friends' family as well. So it was like 6 or 7 of us. I remember the kids were lower level than my dad and his best friend, whose family we played with. So they were higher level, and they would watch us play. I remember at one point we tried to 4-man dead mines because there were 4 kids, and we actually got as far as Mr. Smite, killed him and couldn't kill Van Cleavis for, unfortunately. I think that was our first dungeon.
Wow. Out of interest, do many of them still play?
My friend's dad still does play, and my brother plays, but apart from that, I don't, and one kid from the other family plays. So just, I think 4 out of 8, I'd say.
Wow, that's super interesting. Remind me to chase you up about that later on. Okay. What was your highest raid experience in vanilla, and if anything post-vanilla?
So in vanilla, I got to I did the first, only the first boss. I did Razor Gore and BWL. I cleared all of Molten Core, Zul'Gurub, AQ 20, except for the last boss, I believe. Can't remember too well though in terms of AQ 20, because I honestly just don't have a terribly great memory about it. But definitely Molten Core, all of Molten Core, but this was mostly on patch 1.12, so wasn't terribly difficult with the itemization changes. I had a lot of Dark Mantle gear on my rogue, so it was, fairly overgeared kind of content. But yeah, about that far in vanilla anyway.
And did you do much in any expansions?
Yeah, so I mean, for the expansions after that, Burning Crusade, I didn't finish all of Sunwell. My guild was stuck at and could not kill Muru, so couldn't kill Maru, kill Jaden on the X-Pack, but everything else we downed on content. We killed Vash and Kale after a few months, and so we actually got into Black Temple and T6 before the attunements were removed. Wrath killed everything. Hard modes on, I believe, everything. I think I took a quick break before, right after. No, I did take a break for Trial of the Crusader in Wrath, so I didn't do that in hard mode. I just did it regularly because I couldn't keep up with the raid schedule because I was in. I think there was something. I think it was an after-school play in middle school or something that I was really involved in that I couldn't keep the time up with. I think it was late middle school. And then Kata, I actually started raiding for server firsts. So I don't know, in Wrath as well. So Wrath and Kata are when I started becoming more serious about the game. I joined U.S. progression guilds. I think there were top 50. It was Rage that I stayed with. I think that their name was always Rage. It was on, I think it was on Bailgun. So I don't think I might have transferred servers somewhere in between, but I think that for most of my experience, it was, with them and on Bailgun.
Were you wrestling your time between the role of Nathan Detroit and playing WoW?
Not really. I always found school fairly easy, and my grades were always good. So, and I fenced sometimes in school, nice. In middle school and high school afterwards, but that didn't take a ton of time because it wasn't as regimented as other sports might be because you couldn't have practices every day just because of space requirements at schools and stuff. Okay.
Post the vanilla days, have you done any further vanilla raiding?
Of course. That's the only reason why I would even self-nominate here. I have cleared everything in vanilla on 2 different servers. So on Chronos 2 and Lightbringer. And hopefully now on Northdale for Fresh.
Excellent. So, well, that was my next question, and it sounds like you've just answered it. Are you currently playing World of Warcraft, and where? It sounds like Northdale. Is that right?
Yes. So I'm level 51 right now on Northdale after, what is it, almost a week after launch, a day before week after launch, so 6 days after launch, sitting at 51.
Very impressive.
Currently AoE farming in the Netherguard Keep mines as a undead mage.
Very, very impressive. Fantastic. You mentioned that you have done a lot of high-end raiding and you've cleared everything content-wise in vanilla now on private servers. What guild are you running around with?
So right now I'm running with Celebrity in Northdale, which rolled Horde-side in Elysium. But for Light's Hope, I rolled with Grizzly, which I think a lot of people in the private server community are familiar with. They had first Molten Core clear. They were server first Molten Core in Nostalrius, which made them kind of infamous for no lifing that many 60s. And yeah, before that in Chronos though, I was part of the guild of a bunch of people who were kind of new to private servers and had rushed to 60 as soon as possible. I ended up eventually leading it for a short time before merging with a group of other private server, like long-term private server veterans, just because of how much experience they had to offer. But so Celebrity now, but before Grizzly, and before that I was brief stint of leading my own guild and just playing with a bunch of sort of fresh private server players on Chronos.
No problems. The reason I bring that up is I've been in touch, I think, with the guild manager of Grizzly and was hoping to get them on the show at some point, but maybe that'll happen a bit later down the track on Countdown to Classic, but we'll see.
Okay, AK is, you're talking about AK, right?
Yeah, AK, yeah.
Yeah, he's a great guy, and he's one of the most knowledgeable people about vanilla World of Warcraft that I have ever met. It's part of the reason why I really opted to join Grizzly. They were they were the premier alliance guild that was starting out on Elysium. So it really was there was nothing better because they were the best and they had the most people and the most experience, and I had a lot to learn from them. So it's a great opportunity.
Excellent. Now, do you have a quick plug for any places online where people can find you and your work, if anywhere?
Sure. So I'm actually just I've only ever I haven't actually started until recently trying to become maybe a streamer, content producer. So I don't have a YouTube channel yet, but I'm going to start streaming hopefully Northdale and not get banned by Twitch under twitch.tv/norththemage.
Excellent. Now complete this sentence so we know where your allegiances lie. For the
Alliance every day.
All right, excellent. Now, we didn't really cover this in your initial resume too much, but now that we're going to focus on mages, and this is obviously very much so a mage-centric interview, how much time would you say that you've spent playing a mage?
So I have spent, in terms of days, hours, what do we...
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of, would you be able to guesstimate in slash time played, or just a general feeling? Has it made up 80% of your WoW experience? How would you put it?
I think it's made about probably, in terms of my private server WoW experience, just because of post expansion, like trying to get back those vanilla feels. I think probably 90% of my time on private servers, but on retail, I'd say probably around 30%. But I mean, tons and tons of time. My slash played on both my mage and my rogue on retail were a little embarrassing, honestly. But I was a kid at the time. I had not much better to do, I think.
Fair enough. Now, and it's perfect because you were so young. It's almost like before you discovered girls or anything like that, and you weren't doing anything else. You weren't going out drinking, and all you had time for was WoW. Now, why mages? What is it that truly made you fall in love with that class over all others?
Well, I think it was just a sort of convenience thing. I remember being jealous as a rogue looking around before I made my first mage, seeing these mages be able to make food, make water, teleport wherever it is that they want it to go. Also, and this is still a cornerstone of why I love mages. Blink just seemed so stupid as an ability to me as a rogue, because I'd walk up to a mage, do what I was supposed to do and cheap shot them, and they'd get away every time because I didn't know to gouge them right afterwards at the time. So it was a very frustrating experience. They seemed so slippery with, however many ice blocks and the ability to slow God knows how many people. So it really, from there though, when I started playing it, especially as I started playing it on private servers, I feel like they are honestly the class with the most ability to choose what you want to do. So you can, no matter what's happening to you, if you're a warrior and you're stuck in a Nova and you don't have someone to dispel you, you're sitting there. If you don't have, you might pop a, I want to avoid using, I forget the actual name for what a FAP is, a free action potion to, get out of it and be fine again. But if someone dispels that off of you, you're sitting in that Nova, you're sitting in that sheep, there's nothing you can do. Whereas the only two classes that can always choose, okay, I want to get out of the CC, I need to be able to do something, are Paladin with Bubble and Mage with Ice Block. And Mage has more Ice Blocks, so you will get to choose more, always.
Okay, so another bit of a layup question for you. Mage is generally regarded as, one of the most played classes in WoW. We make the jokes about, warrior mages, like there's a lot of them. Do you feel like just another grain of sand at times, or do you take pride in the fact that your class is popular for a reason?
I really do take pride in the fact that it's popular. To me, it makes a lot of sense. And after playing Mage for so long, especially lately, it baffles me why people want to play anything else. Like Warrior, for instance, being so popular, I don't get it. I think that most people who play WoW must be masochists because it's just it seems like such a, not unfun, obviously, but just such a challenging experience, just from the get-go, whereas Mage is one of convenience, which I think is what attracts so many people to it. But to your point of being a grain in the sand, I think that Mage is potentially one of the easier classes to pick up. But I think that differentiating yourself within is that much more fun then. Being that bit above is difficult, I think, compared to other classes, because you have so many people playing and you have so many people playing at an acceptable level, whereas other classes like Warlock, for instance, might have a higher initial skill curve. So you can see some pretty bad Warlocks fairly frequently, but you'll see a lot of average mages.
Okay, well, that's perfect timing, because literally my next question was touching on this point of differentiating yourself when there are so many of you. I just want to read you a quick quote from the WoW Classics subreddit, and then I've got a question for you afterwards. Now, this is from user Axros, who says the following. If you're playing an overplayed class, all it really means is that you just need to up your game a little. Something like a druid doesn't need to do much in order to get in a guild, but the spots are more contested for rogues and mages for one. It's not something I'd get overly concerned about though. Playing a class you like is far more important than worrying about how much your class is wanted. Now, my question from that post is this. What do you do personally to stand out from the crowd as a mage? I sort of imagine a situation where you're all you mages are standing on the corner and you're peering into cars when they pull up and you're like, hey there, sailor, I give great frostbolt.
Yeah, I think that differentiating yourself really in terms of it depends on the aspect of the game, first and foremost. So if it's PvP, you always have a lot of room to do that. But I think a great example of where differentiation can seem hard, but I think is actually fairly straightforward, is a place like dungeons. At a first glance, one might think that a mage is, it's simple in dungeons. Sheep the thing that you need to have sheeped. Make sure that, you're frostbolting the right target. Counterspell the odd mob that needs to. But really, there's so much more that you can do. If someone, for instance, we were doing Ragefire Chasm in the early levels of Northdale, and I was with a fairly good group, but as often happens in any dungeon, and especially in RFC, someone pulled an extra mob, and we're level 15. We don't have a lot of tools available to us. I already had a sheep target. So, and it's a caster. So what do we do here? Okay, we're in an open area. We can't line of sight. I quickly decide to get aggro of it, just throw a quick fire blast, nova it so it can't move, and then just run behind a pillar. That way, the healer isn't having to deal with it. I can still frostbolt the other mob, and we essentially have a second form of CC that a lot of mages might not think, okay, let me go walk up to aggro and frost nova this mob. I'm the caster. I should, be in the back, and I should just frost nova or frostbolt. But, if you would just sit back in that pull and just only use your damage ability, you'd kind of screw the group a bit. But you have that option to kite, and really you have so many tools available in really every situation. So just using dungeons as an example, that's something that you might do. But say someone pulls, 30 scarabs or all the spiders in Lower Blackrock Spire, and the tank dies. You have the option to kite that. Not a lot of classes do. Hunter might, but other than Hunter, it's just mage.
Well, you mentioned something that it's always interested me, and something for some reason I'm never able to do, even though it should be so simple, and it's the concept of kiting. And clearly, hunters and mages, we talk about how they can kite for days and days. Realistically, when you're, say, leveling 1 to 60, how often are you bothering with kiting? Does it come up that often, or is it probably a bit more than people think? So,
I am a bit of an oddball, I think, in terms of the statistic I'm about to give you, because I don't, in a lot of mage specs, for leveling, and I know we'll get into this a little bit later, but a lot of people will go for AoE specs. And when they go for AoE specs, when they're solo, typically they'll go for a blizzard spec. So there's not a lot of kiting involved, it's pretty simple. You nova, you blizzard, you walk away. But the spec that I prefer is one of improved Cone of Cold. So you use all of your instants, and it's usually with a duo that you do this. So for the past few days, especially from, I'd say probably level 24 when I got Cone of Cold until now at 51, and I'll continue until I'm 60, everything that I'm doing is kiting. I'm pulling mob after mob and using rank 1 Cone of Cold to keep them in line, wanding the odd mob on the wall to make sure that it's part of the larger pack that I, then circle around to get a nice condensed mob pack that I can then AoE.
Okay. What is the greatest misconception about mages that you wish you could dispel?
I think part of it is one of the greatest misconceptions, at least for me, that I'd like to dispel is the ease of mage. Because although it rests on an easy foundation, yes, it's fairly easy to pick up and press frostbolt, use your Cone of Cold correctly, blizzard at the right time. Actually, being a mage at a high level and really making sure that you're not making those mistakes, that even the little things, you're sheeping on time, you're counterspelling the right mobs, you're, not getting frost locked from someone or arcane locked when you don't need to in a PvP situation, so that you can actually use your abilities correctly, or, even knowing how to engage with another enemy, because a lot of the 1v1s that I found, especially with Mage, are very, very skill dependent, other than, the easy matchups. So I think that people often think that Mage is just this, imba class, it's just so easy. But for a lot of matchups, I think there's so much that you actually have to do as a player that not many people do. So I think if I had to dispel anything, it would be just the meme about how easy Mage is. Because while it is easy from a rudimentary perspective, I think the intricacies of the class go beyond what people often interpret.
I'll take you back to another quote from the official forums this time, and this is from user Gimmick, who says the following. I can't decide what class I'll pick when Classic comes out. Is Warlock or Mage more fun in raids? I'm looking for the more fun to kill mobs class, basically. And I hear Warlocks have more buttons to push than a Mage. But I think Mage gear just looks a whole lot cooler. And they do more DPS, even if they do only spam Frostbolt. What recommendations do you have? So, my question flowing on from that post is this. In the spellcaster choice department, if I am either A, a brand new player to Classic, or B, a veteran who hasn't played either of these two classes, tell me why the hell am I picking a Mage over a Warlock when I can see that a Warlock has a lot of tools in the tool belt as well?
For me, it really, and I think that's an excellent question, because I had the same question last launch when Elysium was coming out. I'd played a Mage very, very heavily on Chronos 2, and I thought to myself, hey, Warlock has all these cool utility abilities. You can summon people, you have all these curses, you can dot people, you have pets, you have such an opportunity to shine here, I feel like, and I thought that it would be extremely interesting, and more interesting than Mage, to the point where I rolled one. But what I found is that you don't really get the chance to shine as a Warlock. Most of what you're doing is trying to make other people look good, and when you're doing it optimally. So when you're in a raid for most of vanilla, you're useful because of your curses and how they make mages do more damage or warriors do more damage. You're useful for your summons because it gets people there faster. You're useful for your health stones because, it's useful to have another cooldown health ability. But you're not useful because you're doing the sick damage, because your CC is so great, because you really need to be driving the raid. It's really never the case. Whereas Mage, not really so much in raiding, I found, because, you are there really spamming Frostbolt for the most part, but when you get those AoE pulls, when you, hopefully, if you're kiting sappers in is it sappers? The goblins in BWL, because a mage has to kite those. When you're doing things apart from just spamming one button, it really is that much more interesting, because at the end of the day, Warlock also, especially in PvP, is just Shadow Bolt. You're Shadow Bolting, you throw in your Shadow Burn and Death Coil for movement abilities, but apart from that, it really is sort of the same thing, apart from, a different name on the bolt that you're using. So, and after Mage gets away from Frost, because I don't really enjoy PvE Frost so much, I really can't give that a glowing review. Arcane Frost is not the most fun you're going to have in a PvE situation, because mostly you are just spamming one button. The times after that, actually being a Fire Mage, a lot of fun, a ton of fun, whereas Warlock doesn't ever change. It doesn't ever really improve from the Shadow Bolt spamming that it initially starts with.
So by the sounds of that, it seems that for Warlocks, the motto, same shit, different bolt, might apply.
I think so. I think that it's a good metaphor, but especially in situations like PvP, I really thought that as a Warlock, I was going to be, this, head honcho, this unstoppable killing machine. And to a large extent you are, but when you're doing optimal PvP, say you're in a pre-made, a lot of what you're doing is making sure that people have the right curses on them. You throw cursive elements, for instance, on warriors, so the Frost mages have an easier time CCing them. It's just, and that's really the story of Warlock compared to Mage, is that Warlock is really setting up the alley-oop for the Mage to dunk in a lot of situations, because as a Warlock, you're not running into the flag and just cone of colding after a Frost Nova for 8 guys at Blacksmith in the middle of Arathi Basin and, dealing 2,000 damage crits to 6 people at a time. You're supporting, you're throwing dots, you're whittling people down, you're throwing out cursed tongues. You're not in the face of everyone. You're not, putting out huge damage numbers. You're not in control of the fight in the same way that a mage is.
Now, you talked just before about rotations and things like that while playing as a mage, and I want to ask you about your mage's rotation while leveling 1 to 60. Is it boring as batshit? You've got a lot of cool abilities there, but like raiding in a way, does it just turn into frostbolt spam?
Well, actually, not at all, I found anyway. And this really depends if you're going to do a solo questing spec or an AoE spec. Because AoEing is far more efficient on most patches, especially because the patch I'm currently playing on 1.2, it has reduced quest XP. So you have to end up killing a lot of mobs just to level up. And AoE grinding is one of the best ways to do that. But it's also just better than questing in general on a lot of patches because you can get 50,000, 60,000 experience an hour just AoEing mobs. And for that, it's never really monotonous because, your frost, it's the same sort of formula, go up, collect the mobs, frost nova them, make sure that they're all collected. And then, if one gets out, you have to cold snap. But that really is where I think there's some variety that you get in the rotation because you have to know how to deal with a certain situation. If something resists your frost nova and you're trying to blizzard, blizzard might not be the best move unless you have a cold snap up so that you can toss out a second frost nova. But I think that it's definitely not monotonous if you're doing it optimally. But if you're just going after quest mobs and you just want to press, frostbolt the entire time, you're welcome to do that. But that's not even optimal as a mage. You want to make sure you're weaving in kiting, even from the early levels. The moment you get a wand, your frostbolt, wand, move, fire blast, if you have the mana for it, if you're high enough, and moving again so mobs aren't interrupting you because you have no shields. So you don't want to spend cast time just getting hit by a mob. So I think that if you're doing it wrong, yeah, it's really boring. But if you want to take the time to do it right and to, be the kiting machine that really every mage should and kind of should be and is, it's a lot more fun than just pressing one button.
In terms of DPS and looking at a bit of number crunching now, I'm not sure if you're into theory crafting or if you've looked at the numbers at all in the past, but is it the case that it's clearly the class that you want to chase if you do want to go for that number one slot over, the other caster classes? Is it just put a lock to shame in the DPS department or all other classes for that matter in the DPS department? What can I look forward to in terms of mage DPS?
Well, it depends on the fight for that largely, but I think in terms of looking at casters, absolutely. You have the best DPS on mages sort of across. The only other choice really is Warlock because Shadow Priests are mostly a meme. But when you compare Warlock to Mage, they start off stronger mages because they have the hit talent early on. They have Winter's Chill for an early crit bump, and they scale a little worse, I think, than Warlocks, but the scaling of the Warlock never quite matches the Mage. And then you get to Fire, which is the best scaling damage of the casters, and you have that from AQ on. So really, if you want to be the highest caster, Mage is your best and really only bet. But comparing it to other DPS classes, it kind of gets a little hairy. On a lot of fights, you can win. Ones that don't favor melee so much, ones that have you standing still a lot and not moving. Things like Ragnaros, I typically find myself at the top of the meters for as a mage, or even as a warlock. Those are just, those are caster-friendly fights. But rogues and warriors are, sort of the DPS kings and queens of vanilla by and large. They are, they scale amazingly. They have fantastic gear that starts and ends awesome. And they really have a lot of ability to move around in fights and still keep the same damage output that mages don't have so much, especially when you're Frost.
Okay, I'll take you to yet another post over back at the WoW Classic subreddit, and this is from user Luxembourgs. This one's a slightly longer, so just bear with me while I read you this one.
Of course.
Playing on Chronos they say, I'm playing on Chronos and I just dinged level 11 on a mage. Holy crap, it's boring. Kill a mob and you're almost out of mana. Pull 2 mobs and you're dead. Pull slightly higher level mobs and you're dead. I was questing in Tirisfal Glades and I ran north to do the Agamand Mills quests. Now I absolutely love the Brill quests. I did them as a warrior, a priest, a warlock and a druid many times. But the thing is, with the insane amount of downtime and mana bottlenecking as a mage, it just wasn't fun when I normally love it. It doesn't feel rewarding to kill things incredibly fast and then sit and drink conjured water repeatedly. The warrior and the druid just seemed to push forward and it felt way more rewarding with them. Even the warlock was more consistent. Steady progress forward, even if it takes a tad longer to kill mobs. I mean, I leveled protection once. I love playing solo as much as I love running dungeons. It seems the mage might be fun, just spamming Frostbolt in 5-mans, but solo play just feels like an unrewarding pain in the ass. Is it just me? Now, my question from that post is, and this is personal for me as well, I have tried mages in the past. I cannot get past about level 10, much like this poster says, because I hate downtime. Talk to me about how much realistically is that an issue, and how much time can I look forward to sitting on my ass as a mage?
So actually, I'm glad you brought that comment, because I actually remember that comment. I'm looking for it right now. I can't find it quite, but I actually think I responded to that comment on the subreddit because I was so
enraged.
I know. Here it is. My response to him after, I think the title was "Is Mage Really This Boring?"
Yep.
By Luxembourg.
Yep.
So my response was, no, absolutely not. Mage is amazing. First, like everyone else was saying in that thread, get a wand, because that guy was, if you're spamming Frostbolt endlessly, you're going to have that downtime. That's not, an optimal way to be spending your time. You can't just use the fat damage burst ability. Well, even though it's, not burst, it's your constant spell, but you can't just use it endlessly and expect to not run out of mana. If you did that on Warlock, the same thing would happen. You just have other tools available for that not to happen. Mage is the same thing, except it's in the form of slows. So if you get that, if you get that wand early on, and that's really a cornerstone of my sort of 1 to 10 pathing is farming enough linen to disenchant it and make a wand. You're weaving in wand hits in between so that you don't have as much downtime, so that you're not just sitting and drinking for the entire leveling experience. Although you do have a lot of downtime, no matter what you're doing as a mage, because you are just mana dependent. You are not powerful at all without your mana. But if you prepare correctly, you'll always have enough, and the downtime's not that much. So what I do, for instance, is I actually have a spirit set when I level, so that when I drink, it's a little bit faster, just so I can reduce that downtime, because it is real. You will have to, when you're out of mana, there's next to nothing that you can do. You're not a warlock. You're not a hunter. You can't just send your pet in. You can't just wand and be fine. You can't throw up a dot and just chill. You really do need to make sure that you have mana. But if you're weaving in those wand hits, if you're making sure you're using the optimal ability, not overkilling a mob if it's at 2 health, and using a full rank Frostbolt or a full rank Fire Blast or something like that, you'll have a lot more mana. And it seemed like this guy was really stuck in that area because he wasn't making sure that he was weaving in those hits, kiting like he should, and saving the mana where you can. Because although you have a lot of downtime, what's good about Mage is that it offers you the opportunity to be better by reducing that downtime in various ways, by making sure that you're saving mana where you can, pulling better, pulling more concisely, using less abilities when you need to, kiting more efficiently. It's things like that make you better. And when you get later on, you get to AoE farm. So even though it's, pull 1 mob, pull 2 mobs, and then you're dead, you can't do anything. Later on, that's not the case. If you can run around in a circle and grab 50, 60 mobs if you're with enough people like I am. I'm currently in Blasted Lands farming Netherguard miners. You get 50, 60 of them because you got another mage in there, and you kite around because nothing can hit you if you're good enough, and if you're making sure to avoid the ranged mobs. So then you get in, you frost nova everything, and you just let loose with Cone of Cold, Arcane Explosion, hope maybe a Flame Strike beforehand, just so that they're sitting on that damage over time on the ground, and you're killing a ton of mobs. No other class in the game can do that.
That's an excellent answer, but I'm afraid I can only give you partial credit, North, because you plagiarized one of your previous excellent answers. So now I must ask, tell me if you're not okay with letting this one out, but you mentioned that you obviously answered that on the subreddit. What is your name on the subreddit? Are you okay with getting that out there or not?
Yeah. My name on the subreddit is Xantha. It was I had to switch my name. I had a name change at one point when I transferred servers in, I believe it was Burning Crusade on my rogue. And so I had to change my name from Northy to Xantha at the time. I forget why I chose that name. One of my friends had a name similar to it, and I sort of just extrapolated from it.
No worries.
And back the time I was going by that on my character when I made my Reddit account.
Okay. Now, on to the next question. And once again, I'm going to give you a bit of a quote. And this is from user Axros over at the WoW Classic subreddit, who says this: Elemental is a superb PvP spec thanks to its high mobility, burst damage, and instant cast threats. But it's far too mana inefficient to compete with Deep Frost or Fire builds for leveling, grinding, or basically any PvE task. I strongly suggest just going Deep Frost. It'll almost certainly work better anyway, as the elemental aspect of elemental build doesn't really become a thing until at least level 50 plus anyway. Before that, you're basically just a frost build that has some useless talents in fire. It needs both ice block and blast wave to function. If you absolutely want to level as elemental, then at least get a proper build. Getting both improved fireball and frostbolt is a waste. Not getting ice shards is blasphemy. And skipping out on master of elements when you can get it during leveling is akin to self-flagellation. So, my question from that post is, talk to me about the elemental spec, as they call it. Leveling as an elemental over frost or fire. Can you extrapolate a little bit on this gimmick? Is it a gimmick?
Leveling as elemental is for sure a gimmick. If you want to do it because that's what you find fun and that's what you enjoy, you should. And I mean, especially if you're duo with a healer, for instance, it might be slightly acceptable, but like that person said, really you're kind of shafting yourself because you need blast wave and you need ice block, you need improved cone of cold really as well to make sure that spec is working, because it's predicated on those instant cast abilities and the ability to have ice block to counter the fact that you don't have ice barrier. You really need some defensive ability somewhere. Throw that on top of what that person said as well. Blast wave and, cone of cold, especially without improved cone of cold, are incredibly meta inefficient. They're incredibly great at burst, but apart from that, you're not really getting much. So leveling as it is sort of a meme. That if it's something that person specifically wants, they should, and they are of course welcome to do it. But it's a suboptimal thing. So if you're not really into min-maxing and it's just you enjoy blast wave, you like that a lot, go ahead, rush for it. But like that person was saying, make sure you get the good talents. Get Master of Elements so that you're, more mana efficient on the very mana inefficient spell. Make sure that you're, focusing in one tree first. Don't get improved Fireball ever. Really, that's just not even that good as that's a personal quirk, but I don't think improved Fireball is ever really worth it, because you're not supposed to be spamming Fireball that much, even as an elemental. You'll do it from time to time, but it's not really your primary ability ever. You really want to have Frostbolt in PvP and PvE to have that kiting ability, and that's why it's your spammable. So elemental, it's a great spec. It's fun as hell when you're 60. It's fantastic for its burst. I don't think it's as great as Deep Frost in terms of survivability, but, it's an excellent spec. It's sort of like the Night Flag of Mage, almost. Okay. It's fantastic for its burst, and that has a very real place in PvP at 60. But, it's not Soul Link. It's not SM Ruin in terms of its survivability and just like raw utility that it'll bring through. And especially that's very clear while leveling.
Okay, now, I should ask, you obviously have leveled a mage a few times now. What do you personally love to level as?
So I always level as Deep Frost. For this launch, I actually experimented because I was with a priest and we were duo and still remain duo. Is going into a quick stint into wand spec and arcane concentration, which is clear casting for the people who are familiar with the buff that it gives you. To try and AoE early on, using Flame Strike and Arcane Explosion before you actually get Blizzard, and can use Improved Blizzard. It worked okay. It wasn't great. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't, the best thing that I've ever experienced. So usually I do head for that Deep Frost. And especially early on, the hit that you get from fire spells and frost spells and elemental precision, the reduced cooldown on Frost Nova, the increase of slows just across the board, it's pretty unmatched from any other class, from any other spec in a leveling perspective. And it's the only thing that'll give you Improved Blizzard if you're solo and you want to do those really high efficiency AoE farming that everyone is, sort of off the wall about.
Okay, now, as you can tell, we're going to be getting into specs a little bit now. And just a reminder to all the listeners that this is just the general mage chat. We're going to touch a little bit on all the specs, but obviously one day for each spec, we will be going very in-depth in an interview. And North, it sounds like obviously with you being as well-versed with mages as you are, I'd love to have you back to talk about one of the particular specs, but we'll just sort of lightly brush over them for the moment. Now, but please don't let that hold you back for any in-depth answers that you might have. So
sounds great.
We'll start with this one. And again, apologies for the relatively long quote that I'm going to hit you with, but here we go. This is from Hate Fiend over at Reddit, and they say this about arcane mages. If you're interested in speed leveling to 60 as fast as possible, then this is not for you. For the rest of you who are sick of endlessly casting Frostbolt and want to mix it up a bit, I implore you to try Arcane for leveling. I played on Chronos a while ago and decided to try Arcane leveling for real. I would only use Arcane missiles as my primary ability, and I would only use level 1 Frostbolt for slowing targets if needed. Here's why I found it to be more fun. Fire and Frost specializations really start getting fun as you get more critical strike chance, something you have basically none of while leveling. The big talents in Fire, Ignite and Critical Mass, and in Frost, Shatter, Ice Shards and Winter's Chill, don't get points into them until further down the tree. This means that the fun only starts picking up around the level 30 to 50 area. I think so many of us will stop playing Mage around 10 to 25 because it just doesn't have many interesting qualities. Frostbolt, Frostbolt, Frost Nova, Runaway, Frostbolt, Wand. Okay, so here's my question from that post. Nobody ever seems to talk about arcane mages. I really feel, in my opinion, like it's the forgotten, least talked about spec in World of Warcraft. Why would anyone ever play an arcane mage?
Well, I mean, it sort of depends on the situation. I think for leveling, that person is really light, right? If you don't care about speed, if you don't care about efficiency, you're more than welcome to try it. It will probably kill a mob eventually. But the thing about Arcane is, and the reason why you say that no one plays Arcane is because there really are no main Arcane abilities. There's Arcane Missiles isn't a replacement like that person wants for something like a Frostbolt, for something like a Fireball, because of, at the end of the day, how mana inefficient it actually is. It does a good amount of damage, but and if you spec into Improved Arcane Missiles, it won't get DR if you you won't get pushback from just hitting a mob while it's whacking on you. But Arcane exists really to empower other mage specs. So the Frost, even though that you're PvEing for Blackling Lair and Molten Core is Frost, you're Arcane Frost. You have way more points in Arcane than you do in Frost because you want Arcane power. You want Arcane Mind. You want Arcane Instability, things that increase your spell damage and critical strike chance, things that increase your mana, let you regen while casting. All of those are fantastic talents in a PvE situation. And even, Palm Pyro, something that everyone loves, everyone talks about as more of a meme than other specs, but it has its uses, especially I've found in Warsong Gulch. So if a flag carrier of an enemy pre-made, for example, is particularly slippery and you can't kill him that well, the burst that provides is fantastic, but it's it's Palm Pyro. It's Presence of Mind Pyroblast spec. It's not arcane spec. There's nothing that you can, one of the main abilities, Presence of Mind, that makes your next cast instant, you can't use that with any arcane abilities. There's not a single one. Arcane Missiles doesn't use it. Arcane Explosion doesn't use it. I guess Polymorph could use it, but that's not really your run-of-the-mill exciting damage ability to use it with. It really does exist to empower other things, and I think that that's why it gets the rap that it does. Because it does just sort of exist as a side thing. Later when Arcane Blast was introduced, they had, in Burning Crusade, I believe, you had your spammable ability that made it a viable spec. But because of the lack of spammable ability, lack of main ability in vanilla, there's really nothing available for you. That's why it sort of has the place that it does in the mage sort of toolkit as the support of other elements spec.
What would you say to the mage who turns up to your raid and says, "Hey guys, I'm arcane. Let's go do this hot core place"?
Well, I'd ask him if he was Arcane Frost, first and foremost. And if he told me he was just straight arcane, well, if it were my raid, is this my guild that we're talking? Is this in this hypothetical, is this my guild? Am I raid?
Sure, it's your guild.
Well, hopefully I wouldn't have recruited someone who doesn't know what their spec is in the first place, but hopefully, if I was then in a guild where that kind of person was available, if it were a little more soft core, I'd sit them down and say, "Hey, look, you could be arcane. Just make sure that you have the frost talents baked in and that you're providing good damage for everyone, because I don't want to waste your time. You don't want to waste everyone else's time. So if you're not doing the optimal damage for the spec that you want to play, which in this case is arcane, you're wasting everyone else's time. So just make sure that you're putting in what you need to put in to make sure the team is getting everything that they can out of your participation."
Now, do you agree with me in something I just said earlier in terms of the fact that this is perhaps arguably the least talked about spec in the game, arcane mages? Now, I was racking my brain thinking about things like, I don't feel like protection paladins get a lot of chat. I don't feel like, obviously, arcane mages get a lot of chat. Do you get that impression amongst the community?
Yeah, I think arcane might be especially among those sort of specs of not being talked about, because you'll have the odd paladin who wants to be protection. You'll have a priest who wants to be shadow. Those things are all viable. They have things going for them. Whereas being a pure arcane mage, what are you doing? You're casting mana shield more efficiently. You have improved dampen magic and amplify magic. Like those are the types of abilities that are in arcane. The good ones, like for instance, for a PvP spec, you're almost always going to want improved counterspell, but that's just, it makes your counterspell also a silence. It's not really flashy, clear that you're arcane, because if you're speccing an arcane, you're always going to be using other abilities. You're always going to be primarily using frost or fire spells. So, I think when it comes down to it, the idea of a mage actually being arcane, I think is less talked about than, I want to say, any other spec, because no one does it. No one's going to go around and use arcane missiles as a main damage ability, because any class that has an interrupt is just going to interrupt your channel, and then what do you have left? You have nothing. You have to go use Frostbolt and Fireball again.
I always found that a bit of a shame, because, I don't know, maybe it's just me. I always thought arcane missiles was one of the coolest spells in the game. Did you ever get that impression?
I love arcane missiles. I think I love its use in PvP, which is essentially if people are like running around corners and you can't get a full cast off, it channels, no matter if they're running away or running quickly behind corners, because it just has sort of a leash range and you have to initially be within line of sight. So I always like that. I found it to be a huge shame that there was no arcane blast in vanilla. I really wish that there were, because if that were the case, it would totally be a viable spec to be. Throughout, I think it would contend. It would definitely contend with Frost early on, especially. But there really just is no synergies there. There's no synergies for arcane missiles that you can really give, because at its best, it's you're avoiding interruption, so you're essentially the same as most of the other spells in the mage toolkit if you have a shield on. So Yeah, no, it really is sad, I think, because it's an entire spec that could have had a life in vanilla that didn't. But I think that its role is still useful and cool. Like, Presence of Mind and Arcane Power are two of the, I think, most visible mage abilities, especially when you're talking about like old vanilla PvP videos with the Palm Pyro and the Zandalarian hero charms. That was all like supported by Arcane Power. That was, and that as a staple ability, I think that it's really cool because it's just sort of that fantasy of just doing tons and tons and tons of damage, having tons of power, if you will.
Turning to Frost Mages. Now, with Frost Mages, is this the turn your brain off spec, or is it a bit more cerebral than people think?
In which situation?
Let's say in terms of rating.
As much as I want to be the buff that defends Frost Mage PvE in rating, apart from AoEing, it's pretty turn your brain off, I'll be honest. Making sure that you use your mana potions at the right time, weaving in, if you can, various instant cast abilities is always a plus. But there's actually not a lot that you can do, really to differentiate yourself as a Frost Mage. And if you talk to most sort of rating Frost Mages in hardcore guilds, most of who is the top at the end of a fight as a Frost Mage is whoever got the most crits, which, it's really not a very satisfying PvE experience in the first few raids. But that's not really, I think that people miss the point if that's the reason they want to get into Mage. And they should be very, very clear about the fact that if you want an interesting rotation and an interesting PvE experience single target, in Blackwing Lair and Molten Core, you're not going to get it. But their AoE, so much fun. And their utility is also a lot of fun. Having to sheep things, you don't have to do it a lot in Molten Core, but on things like Major Domo, you're responsible for that, making sure that the goblins are kited in BWL, although even only one mage typically does that. Those are really fun tasks that other classes don't get. For instance, Warlock in the same situation is kind of just stuck shadow bolting everything. They don't even have cool AoE. They just toss down Rain of Fire, which is just a less cool Blizzard for their AoE situations. So yeah, the casters aren't really where you want to look for an interesting raid rotation, unfortunately, early on. But that changes as you get into Fire. So I think that it's a trade-off that's worth it.
You brought up something then that I hadn't really considered before in terms of if you really are gunning for that number one slot and you want to be sitting there at the top of the ladder at the end of an encounter, it pretty much is just the luck of the draw in terms of crits. Now, I'd always thought that if you were racing for that number one slot as a mage, it was basically like 100-meter sprint and it came down to hundredths of a second. Because I always imagined mages sitting at their keyboard waiting for that 0.1 of a second difference when they release the button to get that maximum DPS.
You're not wrong. That's pretty accurate in terms of what you're actually waiting for. It's making sure that those frost bolts are actually going off is really the only thing that you're doing at the end of the day. But making sure that you have mana, though, I think is probably the most important part of raiding that really people could have the potential to fail on, especially with people who aren't experienced with Classic. Because you do take up a lot of mana. And, the mage who is using mana potions and using mana gems on cooldown right away as the mana dissipates, as they use it, immediately will have those mana gems up, will have those mana cooldowns, mana potions up sooner. Whereas another mage might say, oh, hey, I have this great ability, Evocate, I should just use this in the middle of the fight. But if the other mage is sitting over there and he's chugging mana potions, and you're sitting over there on the left and you have to channel no damage for 8 seconds, the guy on the right's going to win 10 times out of 10 unless you crit every single frostbolt, which is probably not going to happen. So, I mean, there's a little bit of intricacy that goes into it, mostly in terms of consumables, mostly in terms of managing your resources, which a lot of people, I think, find unattractive about Mage. The fact that, you do have a lot of downtime, the fact that you are so reliant and can do next to nothing without mana. But I think that that's one of the coolest parts about Mage, is that when you have that mana up, if you make sure that it stays up, you're golden all the way through. You have so much utility, you have so many tools in your kit, you have so much damage, so long as you can make sure that you manage it wisely.
Turning back to PvE now you said that you can go on autopilot a little bit when you raid, obviously, but in terms of the leveling experience, do you think that, same question again, it's perhaps a little bit more cerebral with a mage than people might think?
For sure with AoE grinding, and depending on the situation. Like, for instance, what I've been doing lately in terms of very, very long AoE pulls where you're using rank 1 Cone of Cold to make sure that the group of mobs behind you is constantly slowed and can't just immediately walk up to you and one-shot you because there's 30 of them in there who all want your blood. It is a little more cerebral because you have to make sure that you're managing your mana properly, that you're not over-pulling, that you know how much damage you can do with how much mana you have left, so you know when to stop making that pull. So I think it is a little more cerebral than people give, even a lot more cerebral than people give it credit for, because, you have to make sure you see the next mob, quickly tab to it, wand it as you're having a group of 15 mobs behind you chasing you, slowed down for the next 3 seconds. You have to immediately jump, turn, Cone of Cold as you keep running in the same direction. So it's fun if you want it to be fun, and if you make it challenging, it's rewarding. So I think that that's one of the best parts about mage leveling, and I do think that it is more interesting than a lot other leveling specs. Because if you're a warlock, if you're a hunter, most classes really you're kind of just setting up the mob and then sort of just AFKing until it's dead. If you're a priest, dotting and wanding. If you're a warlock, dotting, sending your pet and wanding. Hunter, so most of the same, just auto shoot and pet abilities. So I think it's actually one of the most interesting leveling experience if you're going to do it as an AoE grind, because you have to make sure that you're timing things correctly, that you know when your cooldowns are up, that you know what you can do, and that you are staying far enough away from the group of angry engineers behind you trying to kill you in Netherguard Keep.
Shifting gears now to fire. Now, if I were to say this to you, frost feels lame to me. I want to melt faces, not freeze them. Please tell me that fire isn't that far behind frost, perhaps, in leveling in terms of burning things down and getting to 60.
In terms of a solo leveling experience, again, if you're going to do the, Frostbolt one mob, if we're not counting AoE, it's actually really good. And it does a good amount of damage. The abilities that you get in fire, things like Master of Elements that refunds spell criticals, the base cost of spell criticals, things like improved Fire Blast, given that Fire Blast is actually a fantastic ability. Ignite is great for crits, but the reason why it's not as optimal as it could be is because so many of these things that even from me just reading them off rely on crits. You get your mana back when you crit. You get increased damage when you crit. And when you have no stats, it's not as fun. So if you're going to do solo, I think it's a lot cooler actually to go fire because, you get those sick damage numbers. You get, I think, cooler looking abilities. Ignite always looks really cool when it, has the mob go red. Same thing with just like Fireball in general. I think they're really great looking spells, and I think they're a lot of fun to use. But it's not as strong, and so for me at least, it feels not as fun at the end of the day. But once you get that gear, once you get to 60, if we're not talking about leveling, fire is, that melt faces kind of spec. If you want to go full fire, that actually works. A mage in Nax gear, for instance, or AQ gear who's fire spec for raid, if someone comes up to them and they can melt through that person fairly easily. But I think the best example of what fun melt faces fire looks like is elemental, like that guy was saying before, because you have so many instant cast spells. You have really cool looking spells. Blast Wave, I think, is one of my favorite mage abilities because of, just how awesome and cool it feels to use, because it's an AoE slow around you that you really lack in terms of fire, because you have Frost Nova, you have Arcane Explosion. Flame Strike feels kind of lame, but Blast Wave feels so great.
Would you agree, and I think you might have mentioned it earlier, that frost leveling is a little bit quicker than fire leveling?
Oh, for sure.
Okay. Now, in saying that, I know it's hard to quantify, but if you had to do the good old guesstimate, how much faster is it? How much are you shooting yourself in the foot if you're racing to 60 and you pick fire? Is frost, say, 5% quicker, 10% quicker? What would you say?
If you're racing to 60... I'd say, whenever you put it down to a race, frost is probably like at least 10 times better than fire, which is a little extreme, but it really all comes down to, if you're racing, can you AoE farm? Fire, you really can't. So not in an efficient way, not in a way that doesn't make you want to, actually shoot yourself in the foot. So it is a very, very large discrepancy if you're going for speed leveling, especially. But if it's solo leveling, if you're trying to take it a little slower, if you just want to, get your quests through and, just kill mob after mob, not really, get those huge pulls and just grind for hours in a spot, I'd probably say it's only like 10 to 20, maybe 25% better than Frost at just killing straight mobs one-on-one.
Now, here's the big question, and this has been a little bit of a bigger deal than I thought it would be when I have been tearing through mage topics over the last few months. Frost versus fire outside of raiding. You're at 60, and let's say you're not a raider, but you're picking between the two specs. Settle the argument. Where do you lie?
Well, if you're not doing raids, fire is actually a lot of fun. Some people really like for when they hit 60 and they start farming dungeons, to go fire, because they won't get to do it for a really long time if they want to do it in a raiding environment. The damage is good, but as it always is, it relies so much on stats. It relies so much on having crit, because of, how great Ignite is, but it doesn't have those easy stats that Frost gives you. Things like Winter's Chill make you so much more optimal without gear that Fire just doesn't have. So for me, I'm always chilling in Frost just because of how much better it is in PvP. And most of why I play Mage is because of how much fun it is in PvP. But it depends on how you consider Elemental, because Elemental is, both. So I think that is probably Elemental is probably one of the most fun specs for Mage, and really it's neither Fire nor Frost. So if put to the Fire on one of my favorite specs, I really couldn't choose, because there's so much that each offers, just depending on what point you're at in the server.
Oh man, fence sitting! Come on, North. All right.
I know it's not a ton of fun, but I mean, there is so much that each offers if you are going to go for it. If you're going to cut out the optimal PvE environment, fire is really a lot of fun. Seeing those numbers, seeing the giant pyroblast, approach, fly at the boss after any odd dungeon pull. It's a lot of fun, and sometimes it can be more fun than just spamming Frostbolt. So I think in a PvE environment, I'd always choose Fire. Fire is tons of fun. It looks great. It feels great. But if I'm leveling, if I'm PvPing, which are most of the things that I'm going to be doing, or if I'm pre-AQ raiding, I have to go Frost. It's just, the best. You have so much more survivability with Ice Barrier, with Permafrost, with Cold Snap, and Ice Block, that it's just really no contest in terms of what makes Mage feel the most powerful at the end of the day.
Okay, back to another quote from the WoW Classic subreddit, and I just want to read you the following and get your comments. So it says this: if you're dank at AoE farming as a mage, you get to skip the shitty long grinds that most other classes have to do. If you know which skills you need to level and conserve your money, you get your mount right at level 40 and you don't have to wait. If you know how to farm well at 60, you get to have consumes on consumes and dick on random shitters who can't. What do you say to that comment?
10 out of 10 would agree.
And why is that?
It's one of the best parts about Mage is just the ease of is that convenience. But I think that people mistake convenience for ease in a way that they don't really understand, because so much of vanilla WoW is do you have those consumes? Do you have that gear? Do you have your epic mount? Do you have the money for it first and foremost, which Mage is very good at getting. The Hunter probably is the better farming class just from a doing Dire Maul tributes perspective, but Mage can get a lot of money very easily, can level exceptionally quickly and skip, the crappy mid-40s grind. Mid-40s leveling is the worst. I hate it. It's awful. But if you're a Mage, you just sit at the Murlocs in Dust Wallow, and then you sit at the Murlocs in Swamp of Sorrows. You're there for a couple of hours. you're way ahead of your friends who were close to you in level beforehand, and you don't have to deal with ganking all the time because you're in just one area consistently. And you don't have to run around, spend half your time walking before you have a mount because you just stay in the same area and you kill mobs. So it does add so much convenience that just lets you play the game from a higher level oftentimes and have an easier time of doing it. Because if you can grind those lashers and DMEs, for instance, and have the money to have limited invulnerability potions on you at all times, then rogues who come up to you and try and kill you in the world are going to have a really hard time. And that just makes it feel so much better than the other people who can't afford it because their consumes are too, because they still don't have their mount, because they have to spend all their money on spells, or they can't farm that well without another class. It just affords you so much independence from really a lot of the functions of the game that would otherwise have you be less optimal and less strong in PvP and PvE situations.
You said you were 10 out of 10 in agreement with that particular quote. Is there any other reason why you feel so forcefully about it?
Well, I mean, the feeling when you have those resources as a mage fighting other classes is one of absolute supremacy. You can take off all of your gear and fight a warrior, and you shouldn't lose. At the end of the day, if two people of equal skill are on a mage and a warrior trying to 1v1 each other, if the mage has no gear on at all and the warrior is like, say, full BWL gear, so long as the mage doesn't make a mistake or there's not some lucky freak accident, the mage should win that 10 times out of 10. So it's just things like that. And then if you have those resources and you're going against other mages, for instance, you can easily win. So it's just the experience of being a fully farmed, fully equipped, fully consumed mage in the world is so much fun. Because it affords you the ability to, for instance, I remember I was on Chronos 2 right after I leveled to 60, and everyone was fighting over, because they didn't delay world bosses on that server, everyone would fight over over Azure Ghosts and Ajara, periodically, because we wanted to make sure the other guilds couldn't do it while they were still getting people to 60. That's when you could have a mage, if they were full consumed with a paladin next to them on Alliance, just run in and kill, 20, 30 people if they were with enough other mages. It would just be 1, 2, 3 of us against a team of 20. And if you play it right, you can kill all of them. So really, when that guy says you can just, dumpster on random people, he's not wrong. It feels really great when you do it right, and it feels so much more satisfying, I think, than any other class in large scale.
When you talk about that guy, do those words seem a little bit familiar to you?
Are you quoting me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad I said 10 out of 10 that I agree with, because that does actually, thinking back, that does sound written in my voice. Yeah. I stand by those words. Yeah. Mage is absolutely fantastic. If you can make sure that you're really up to date and equipped.
All right, you're high-fiving your past self.
I good on you for doing that. I did not realize that's.
All right. Well, you've talked about, obviously, a fair bit on AoE farming and some great information there in terms of a few tips. But is there anything outside of, we talk about things like Diamol and the Crocs at Zolgarub or what have you. Any tips outside of that? Any little areas that you like to sneak away to for AoE farming as a mage?
It depends on what side that you are, really. Because there are good spots depending on if you're Horde or Alliance. One spot that I found that's a little lesser known from Horde side perspective as a mage is the Theramore Deserters. So in the south of Dustswallow, there's actually in the Quagmire, there's a tower. And most people probably remember, there's just a tower of a lot of Theramore Deserters. As Alliance, you have to go there to turn in a quest to kill some random, the ringleader of the Deserters. But that tower has 2 really, really great pulls because they're all melee and they're so dense. And then south of there is a Raptor Cave. So you can, if someone is contesting the Murlocs, for instance, in the north of Dustswallow, which is often the case because everyone knows about that spot, you can just go south and, it's a fantastic spot. I think it's actually more XP per hour. Because of the higher level of the Deserters and the Raptors in the south. And it's a very, very satisfying pull just because of how many you're killing at a time.
Now, just shifting gears slightly back to what we were talking about before in terms of rating, and in terms of specs. Now, you've mentioned, and I think it is somewhat universally accepted, as you say, that from AQ onwards, you're pretty much going to be fire and not looking back at frost. Is it the case that, that's absolutely the way you've got to go? We talk about that scary word, changes and changing specs. Is that just 100% what you've got to do?
I mean, by and large, yes. But I think most people would really, like, the reason why you rarely see any frost mages is because everyone is so much more down to play the shinier spec that fire is in PvE. So I mean, you could be a frost mage, and still raid in Nax. You'd be worse for sure because you don't scale as well, because Ignite has just such amazing scaling criticals. And Fireball has a higher damage coefficient, I believe. So, you just are scaling better at that point in the game, and the mobs are no longer immune to your fire. And that's really the reason why people hold off on it, is because you just can't use it in the first two raids. So it's not game breaking. You could have a guild of all frost mages theoretically. It wouldn't be great, and I just really don't see a reason of doing it because of how much fun fire is compared to frost.
Now, how many mages would you say should be in a raid?
It depends if you're Horde or Alliance. So on Horde, you're going to want less, just because of how strong warriors and rogues are, and because of Wind Fury. So you're going to have a lot less mages. So I think it's 4 to 5 typically that you have in Horde, maybe even less. But for mages in Alliance, you're going to want 5 or 6. You have things like, for instance, Salve is a game changer for mages, also for warlocks. But because of fire later on, when a mage takes those Ignite ticks, that's a ton of threat. So if you don't have that on your caster, you don't have Vanished, you're not a rogue, you can't get away from that. So really, you're dealing with a lot of threat problems on Horde for mage, and really warrior as well, that you aren't with Alliance. So probably 5, 6, 7 if you're Alliance, just because of how well they scale. With the Alliance and Paladins in general, a little less, 4, 5 on Horde. So although it's so often played, it does have a large spot in raids and dungeons as well. So it's you have the opportunity to play in, probably in really most guilds, because although people won't always be looking for mages, you'll probably be able to find yourself a spot just because of the volume that people need. You're not a druid. You don't need one per raid.
Now, I'm allowed one stupid question per interview, and it's time for that stupid question here where I show my sort of lack of experience a little bit. But I do see this often over at the forums, and I don't fully I kind of understand it, but not really. Maybe I'm way off base, and you can tell me how wrong I am. But why would you choose mages over other DPS roles in a raid when you've got the issue of debuffs? And is it that reliance on Winter's Chill? Can you talk to us about how that plays into things in a raid scenario?
Sure. So, the reason why you choose mage is because mages take only one debuff slot at the end of the day, early on. Later on, you'll want to have Nightfall. Actually, they take 2 because of Curse of Elements, but they're worth their bang for the buck, because they don't need things like a SM Ruin Warlock, for instance, needs Corruption. Whereas mages, Frostbolt, the slow is not going to be on the boss because most bosses are immune to the slow, and it's really low priority, that debuff, so it'll get pushed off. So mages only have to have Winter's Chill, which works for all the mages, and Curse of Elements, and that's it. So you have 2 debuffs for potentially 5, 6 people in the raid. So it's a very efficient use of time. Whereas Shadow Priest, for instance, maybe they want Shadow Word Pain up. They can't really have it. Maybe they want Shadow Weaving up. They can't have it. Same thing with Warlocks. Early on when there's only 8 debuff slots, you don't give the buffs to Warlocks because they're not worth it yet. So that's the reason why Mage, I think, is really strong early on with the casters, because they take so little and they give so much back, because it's only 2 debuffs for an entire set of classes. Whereas like Warriors and Rogues, you need your Sunders, you need your Annihilate, you need your Crystal Yield potentially, Curse of Recklessness, Fairy Fire. Like, you have so many things to increase their armor, but that's all of the melee classes fit together. Whereas if you want something like a Boomkin, they can't put Moonfire up on the boss. That's not allowed. So really, because there are no damage over time abilities that Mage has in Frost, is why that it's so efficient to have so many of them.
Okay, completely changing lanes now over to PvP. Can you tell us, what's your experience? Do you PvP much at all?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. I know you mentioned that you like to play on PvP servers, but what kind of ranking have you done in the past?
So I have I ranked on Chronos 2 to rank 13 on my Mage there, and I ranked to rank 12 on a Mage in the Mage alt that I made on Light's Hope, which was originally Elysium.
Excellent. Then you're a fantastic person to ask the following question. And again, we've got a quote from the WoW Classic subreddit and user Amatune who says this. My favorite thing to do in PvP as a fire mage was Pyroblast, Presence of Mind Pyroblast. There's some initial cast time, but once they taste fire, they are dead. Oh, and I'd also die a lot. So my question is, talk about the mages in PvP as the proverbial glass cannons. Well, firstly, I'd say, do you basically have to be fire in PvP? I know, is it preferential to Frost? And secondly, talk about, are you absolutely a glass cannon and can you expect to die a lot?
If you're fire, absolutely. You, especially if you're Palm Pyro, that is that. But that is more of, honestly, it's more of a meme spec. It has its uses if you really need to burst one person, if there's a problem. Person on an enemy team, for instance, usually comes down to Warsong Gulch and needing to kill a flag carrier is the only reason you'd actually use Palm Pyro optimally. In that case, you are a glass cannon. You have no ice barrier. You have no defensive abilities. You have no ice block. You're just, your guns blazing, trying to kill one person, and that's it, which is really the definition of glass cannon. But Mage is really fantastic, I think, because of how survivable it actually is in Deep Frost. So Ice Barrier, you have essentially, I forget what the value is at 60, but it's a several hundred damage spell that is low cooldown, lasts 30 seconds longer than its cooldown as well. So you can have multiple of it fairly quickly and is, essentially its own heal. So you get a several hundred damage shield that doesn't allow your casting to be interrupted, along with some of the best CC in the game, makes you actually one of the kind of, not tanky, but survivable members of a PvP situation because you can blink away, you can frost over people, you can sheet people off of you. So you have so many tools to make sure that you're not dying. If you're caught without any shields, if a shaman purges everything off of you and you're just sitting out there in the open and there's a warrior who's charging you, you're going to die in 2 hits for sure. But if you're making sure that you're prepared, if you have your abilities up, if you're making sure that you're with friends preferably, but really, if you have those abilities up, if you make sure that your defensives are there and present, you shouldn't be dying too quickly because Mage is the only class that, again, has 2 of those protection abilities, and they can use them back to back. Paladin has Bubble. We have double Ice Block. I can survive for 20 seconds in a group of 400 people if I want to, and then Cone of Cold right after I get out, whereas no other class can do that. So even though it appears, sort of glass cannon, and the fire specs, Elemental and Palm Pyro primarily are very, very bursty and very glass cannon. Frost itself is actually if you play it safely, is fairly well survivable, especially in 1v1 situations with other classes who don't have heals, because Ice Barrier functions as its own kind of heal. You
mentioned that, there may be some issues with warriors at times, and the answer may well be warrior, but is there any other class or any class in particular that you, as a, pretty handy PvP player, if you see a skilled member of this class coming your way, you start to just poo your pants a little bit?
And just for the record, I want to go on record as a warrior in like Warsong Gulch. If I'm being spam purged and they have a paladin on them, or they have and they're not being dispelled, then a warrior's a problem for a mage. But in most situations, mages absolutely dumpster on warriors, no questions asked. That's definitely your easiest matchup. I just want to make sure that I go on record correctly there.
Sure.
But I mean, if they get on you, then you're a little screwed, but hopefully they're not. But in terms of a matchup that to your question, just kind of shit my pants when I see someone running of a, high caliber, definitely Hunter. Hunter is that terrible, terrible matchup. They have enormous, enormous damage from so much range, and Viper Sting is potentially the worst thing in the game. They throw that on you, and like I was saying before, Mage is all about having mana, and Viper Sting takes that away from you. So Hunter really does just kind of throw a a wrench in the formula of mage, because they can sit from a range, very easily drain you of all your mana, and then come in and just, dumpster all over you with the pet. And if they're BM, which doesn't tend to happen in, high level PvP after 60, when hunters get gear, they tend to exit Beastmaster. But early on when they have Beastmaster and when people are leveling early on in servers with Beastmaster, it is the absolute worst, because you can't CC that pet when they pop the 41 talent. I think Bestial Wrath, I think it's still called that. And if they pop that and there's nothing you can do to the pet, it's just going to wail on you. It's going to push back all of your spells. You can't Frost Nova it. You can't Cone of Cold it. You can't Sheep it. And it's just going to kill you because it has high base damage to the point of just murdering you.
Okay.
So for sure, Hunter. It's potentially the worst matchup of Mage, I'd say. Shadow Priest as well, but a little less common, so.
Okay, one final quote for you, just from the WoW Classic subreddit. And this is from Eladan456, who says this, and this is about a request for a mage theory crafting resource. And they say, well, what do you want to know? How much Frostbolt per minute you can throw in Molten Core? And my follow-up question is mage theory crafting dead or non-existent, because it really is just Frostbolt, more Frostbolt, and who can hit the button quicker than the next person? Do you look into any of that stuff, or is it just ridiculous?
It's not ridiculous, but I mean, it's worth, looking at. For instance, a crit will have a different spell power value depending on how much hit you have. But it's when they pull down to it, it is a fairly easy calculation, because you can just say, okay, the only thing I'm going to be doing primarily is just spamming Frostbolt. So what's the spell power coefficient on Frostbolt? How much damage do I gain from a crit? How much damage do I lose from a miss? And then just look, and it's fairly simple algebra, which compared to other classes, warriors, you'll have, you have other abilities that, pull from different stats more or less. So having, extra agility on a warrior for extra crit might look differently. So like different pieces of gear might look different, whereas mage is sort of just, okay, how much is this spell power worth compared to this crit, compared to this hit, and really not much else. So it's not dead. Definitely people do get it wrong, and people, go for crit where they shouldn't, or go for spell power where they should be going for crit. But other than that, it's not very complicated at all. It really is just let's do the math. Let's do the simple algebra on Frostbolt. Is this worth it? Okay, let's do it. Or it's not. Okay, let's avoid this.
When we talk about hurling Frostbolts, is there a favorite raid encounter of yours as a mage that gets you away from that Frostbolt spam and you really enjoy it because you feel like Batman using all the tools in your utility belt?
For sure, I'd say early on, especially Blackwing Lair in the trash packs. I'd say that's probably the most fun, because you have to. A lot of what you're doing as a mage in the world is because you're spending so much time in vanilla farming for consumes, farming for your epic mount, etc. Is AoE farming and kiting, and so that offers you the opportunity, really, in a high stakes kiting situation. Because if you fail that kite, if you aren't in the right second, and all of those 30 goblins hit you with the dynamite that they're throwing on you that you have to sort of circle around with, then you're going to die, and those are all going to run on the healers and kill them all. So I think that probably it's kind of lame to say a trash pull in a dungeon, but it is a lot of fun just kiting those compared to other bosses where you're just sort of sitting there and being the Frostbolt turret that everyone knows and loves.
Cool. No, I totally understand. All right. So next up, are there any items off the beaten path that you look for when you're leveling as a mage?
So actually one that I found this sort of leveling experience that I didn't know about before was a belt that tailors can make. It's, I think, spider silk belt. And I spent forever looking for a blacksmith who actually could make an iron buckle, because it has a use to remove immobilizing effects on you, which especially I never encountered that issue because prior to this undead mage that I'm currently leveling, I'd never made a non-gnome mage, so I was so used to having escape artist and never really having any trouble with immobilizing effects. So I think in terms of leveling and just like utility there, a lot of what screws you is not having an ability to get out of those nets. So it just adds like another tool in that situation to remove it. So that's really one that I go for. Also, I usually try and hit Nifty Stopwatch and Skull of Impending Doom, which are, two pretty common, not off the beaten path PvP items, but I try and hit them as early as possible while I'm leveling and sort of fit it in if I can, because you can AoE grind most of the mobs for those quests. It's a little difficult because the rock elementals are immune to slow, but you can kind of just, hit them with that raw damage and get a few of them. So I think that that's definitely worth it, just to get those, because you feel so much better as a mage when you have more speed abilities available.
If I were to ask you, what's the greatest break glass in case of emergency tool in the game? And I know you might have touched on it earlier when you talked about dropping this in the crowd of 400 people and just being able to laugh in a way. But, until it fades and you might be awaiting certain death. But would you answer that question with 2 words, ice block?
For sure. It's such a fantastic ability. It has the same mechanics as Bubble. Unfortunately, you can't use spells in it, but really it is that oh shit button. Whereas Bubble, potentially you might need to heal during it. It really is that let's not die right now button that you can use very often and really just to no ill effect. It's a fantastic ability that's fun to use, for sure. But, Bubble is probably better. But in terms of the class toolkit that you have, Mage has the ability to use it better. If Mage had Bubble, people would be so angry, because if you could still damage people while invulnerable as a mage, it'd be a little ridiculous. Paladin doesn't have the toolkit really to use that in a way that's so egregious. So while I think the Bubble's a better oh shit button just because of how much flexibility it affords you, I think that the combination of the Mage toolkit with Ice Block really is the sweet spot for me.
All right, last question leading into the fun stuff. Do you have a funniest polymorph moment?
Double polymorphs are always hilarious. I think that they're probably one of the most humorous mage v mage parts, because mage versus mage matchups can be really stressful because you're both trying to juke each other out and have one person waste their counterspell or counterspell the wrong school of spell. So it's a very sort of intense, cerebral heavy, also mechanics heavy, attempt to, just overpower another person with all the same tools that you have. So when it happens and both people polymorph each other at the same time and they don't try and counterspell it out and you just both sit there in a full sheep, it's pretty funny.
All right, North, you've made it through the hard stuff and now it's time for the fun stuff, and we'll kick off with anger management. Each interview, I ask the interviewee to get some of their angriest thoughts off of their chest. So, North, what is it that makes you angry about World of Warcraft?
The fact that hunters can just exist unopposed in the state that they are in World of Warcraft, honestly, is ridiculous. They can any caster that they want from as far away as they want. They have essentially a mount speed run at all times that they can just turn off and on, oh yeah, you can get dazed, but you can just turn it off, it doesn't matter. And while they're leveling, they have a pet that does more damage than them and can travel faster than a mount. I was running away from a hunter earlier today on a mount, and his pet, in bestial wrath, caught up to me and kept hitting me and killed me. It's ridiculous.
All right.
Insane, honestly.
So maybe it's nerf hunters.
Please.
All right. With that done, now it's time for the hot seat. Each interview, I put the interviewee on the hot seat and ask them a few fun, hypothetical questions about the game. So, North, you ready for these ones?
Let's do it.
All right. A mage, a lock, and a shadow priest walk into a bar. Who gets the girl and why?
The mage. because, of course, he's already there conjuring cocktails for the girl beforehand, whereas the warlock's sitting in the corner trying to fumble through his bag for a soul shard, and the Shadow Priest is too busy being useless to know what's going on.
Very good. All right, are you familiar with the game Fuck, Marry, Kill?
Of course.
All right, 3 things. Fuck, marry, or kill. And I'm going to give you 3 mage abilities, and you have to pick between the 3. So fuck, marry, or kill. Teleport, conjure water, or polymorph. And polymorph, I should say.
Fuck polymorph, because it's potentially one of the most flashy abilities in terms of CC that you can have. It's just, that, visceral appeal. It's, it's a sexy ability. Marry teleport, because of, how useful it is just in the day-to-day kind of sense. It's, the bread and butter of not having to spend hours and hours walking and flying around. And for sure kill conjure water, because the fact that I need to conjure, 400 water prior to every single raid to just toss out to people, and then I should be expected when anyone ever opens trade with me to automatically trade them like 6 stacks of water is a little sad.
Well, flowing on from that, maybe I should ask, what's the one thing you've always wanted to say to someone who just rudely opens that trade window for water?
What the hell are you doing? Especially if it's some random person in a major city who just opens trade. We're not in a group. There's no reason that I have to sit here and just conjure water for you. I don't know you. You don't know me. We don't have any rapport. What's your deal?
There could be anything in that water. I might have spiked it.
Exactly. Come on. Find someone that you know instead. Don't bug me just because you don't have any mage friends. That's not my problem.
All right. Now, if you could teleport yourself anywhere in the world in real life, dare I ask where you would want to be?
Huh. That's a great question. Probably, the criminal side of me would probably say inside of a bank, if I could just get back after, so I could just, take a whole bunch of cash and, feed it into a streaming setup and supply of money to prevent me from having to do any actual work for the rest of my life. But if it weren't in the middle of a bank, probably down to Blizzard HQ into their offices to give them some tips and hints to make sure that Classic does not suck.
Very good. Now, if you could conjure only one food item for the rest of your life, what would you conjure?
That's a great question. Ripe pears, probably.
Specifically
ripe pears. Because pears by themselves, whatever, you have to wait so many days for their, until they're actually edible and not rock goddamn hard. But if I could conjure some ripe pears, that'd be fantastic.
You're way more healthy than I thought. I thought it was going to be like a Big Mac or something. All right. What best describes your personality in voice chat during raids? Icy, fiery, or just magical?
Definitely not magical. Perhaps a bit erratic, if I have to be honest, and very vocal.
So maybe fiery.
Yeah, probably fiery. A little salty as well, definitely.
All right. Now, the language filters are off and you can't be banned. What's the one thing you've always wanted to scream at someone who talks shit about mages being a one-trick pony in raids?
It's not even really a screaming type of thing. It's just, most classes are that way. So I'd want to shake them a bit and get them to realize that almost everything is like that in vanilla. So they really shouldn't be, talking up whatever class that they're in the first place, because there's probably some pompous warrior that, it's just only focused on meters and is dying in fire half the time anyway. So there's not really much you need to say to them, because people who think that are, short-sighted anyways.
Okay. What's the meanest thing that you've ever done in the game?
Definitely bullied out other mages from AoE spots. It's a bit scummy. It's definitely a bit griefing. But sometimes it's necessary when you've been someplace for a couple hours and some young startup mage tries to come and take your spot. Sometimes you just got to make sure that you kill them. So even if they're the same faction, there's always ways. If someone's handling a lot of mobs at the same time, Mage does have the ability to just, sort of kill them at will by, frost-noving them in the middle of mobs, the mobs in the middle of the person, excuse me. making sure that their mob is sheeped until they run out of mana. You get the picture. It's not a thing that I'm proud of, but it's sort of a necessary thing sometimes when people don't want to work with you.
Do you have a proudest in-game moment?
Chronos 2, Azure Ghost fighting. It was me, a mage named Dr. Christie, and I forget who the third mage was. But we, as a group of 3, with 3 paladins behind us, wiped a full group of, it was over 80 people, because they were setting up and they were buffing after an Azure Ghost wipe, and we found the hill that they were on. So definitely, when it was straight up, we killed every single one of them, and none of us died. Definitely my proudest moment.
Do you have a most embarrassing in-game moment?
Every single time that I get caught with my pants down, having counterspelled in the middle of a sheep or something, and proceed to have everyone just pile on and kill me.
What was the moment that you realized you were going to be a mage for life?
I think the moment that I realized that was when I was fighting with, there was 3 people. It was a rogue, a warrior, and a shaman that ganked me in Stranglethorn, and I was by myself, and they kept trying to kill me, in one pull, but through Nova and Cone of Cold and just being able to blink away because it was pre-40, and I managed to get in the water and hide. I realized that because it was just so easy to pick my fights, that I'd probably be a mage for life.
And final question: tell me why you, North, are most excited for World of Warcraft Classic.
It's going to be so much fun to have the actual original code there, people working on it, the community back in the volume that it was before. But I think the thing that I'm most excited for is the videos that people will make as they did before. Because in the era that, I played, vanilla WoW, people made those videos before there was any revenue to be gotten out of, YouTube really, or streaming. So it's going to be exciting to see with the people who can actually make a living out of it, what kind of content we're going to get from the community and what kind of, awesome things that we're going to see from everyone.
All right, North, you made it through the interview. Please do plug your stuff again. Tell people where can they find you.
You can find me at twitch.tv/norththemage, all one word. I'm just starting up streaming, so not streaming too much of the leveling process because, killing mobs over and over in random mines is not the most exciting stuff, but hopefully I'll be streaming PvP soon on Northdale.
North, thank you so much again for taking the time out for Countdown to Classic today. This was obviously a rather extensive, in-depth mage chat. I'd love to get you back sometime again if you're up for it later down the track to go into one of the specific specs. But just for now, for today, thank you so much. I do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it a lot.
And that's the interview done, and thank you so much again to North for taking so much time out for Countdown to Classic and being an amazing interviewee. I will definitely attempt to have him come back on the show and share some more of that knowledge with you all later down the road. But now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, it's time for a really intriguing call with game developer Deathlace, who initially signed up for a quick 10 to 15 minute chat. However, we just kind of kept going, as you may have realized can happen in some of my interviews when I ask question after question after question. And I hijacked the chat into a bit of a mini interview, which got super duper interesting. So here's that call as we chat game design principles on today's Calling Countdown. Okay, we've got a caller on the line, and who are we speaking with?
So I go by the name Deathlace, of late, anyway, on a bunch of the recent vanilla servers that I played on.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for calling in, Deathlace. Now, You approached me a few days ago and you said that you happened to catch one of the latest episodes of Countdown, and it was the interview that I did with Tank, obviously talking about a few misconceptions about some specs within the game. And within that interview, Tank did touch on Smite Priests, and you hit me up saying, hey, funny that Tank actually mentioned some of the work that you had done on Smite Priests in the past. Is that correct?
So actually, a lot of the work that I had actually originally done had nothing to do with Smite Priests even. So to kind of go back a little bit, I actually started playing Nost, like the Nostalria server some time ago, and there was very little information available about Shadow Priests. There used to be a site called, I think it was shadowpriest.com from ages ago, and that just kind of shut down. So there was just no information about Shadow Priests. And I happened to be playing a Shadow Priest on that server. So I decided to take it upon myself to make kind of a DPS spreadsheet of sorts to kind of help everyone else kind of decide on their gear and, figure out the optimal rotations and everything. And what kind of went from there was I started, messing around with a bunch of other specs, and I was like, hey, Smite sounds cool. Let me try that. And as it turns out, Smite was also a lot of fun to play, that I decided to make a sheet for a Smite Priest as well, and so on and so forth. I've made sheets for like a bunch of casters, mostly, I guess, the so-called meme specs, because they tend to be less researched in general, which makes it more fun for me to kind of look into all the various things that make them tick and see, how much can you push a spec like this?
So in your research, what was the answer? How much could you push a spec like that? What did you find you could achieve with a Smite Priest?
So the problem with Smite Priest, so there are a few problems that a Smite Priest has, right? It comes down to lack of any hit talents, which means you have to get 16% hit from your gear in order to, reach your hit cap. The second problem is mana. Your Smite is a mana hog, and requires the fights to not go too long. And third, there's no curse, like Curse of Shadows, Curse of Elements, that increases the damage that Smite Priests have. However, you have Sanctity Aura, which, it is having a ret in the game, but look, when we're looking at how far we can push it, we're looking at all the sources that in the game that you could conceivably look up and see what you can do with such a spec. So the problem fundamentally with Shadow Priests is their talents are absolutely powerful. They're crazy strong. They have a 10% hit talent. They have 15% damage. They have a lot of crazy stuff. But the problem with Shadow Priests comes down to how badly they scale. So Shadow Priests use, say, 3 skills. They use Shadow Word Pain, they use Mind Flay, and they use Mind Blast, right? Now, Shadow Word Pain cannot crit. Mind Flay cannot crit. So it's just Mind Blast that can crit. So essentially that means Shadow does not scale with crit. Okay. Shadow does not need a lot of hit because you get 10% hit from talent, so you need about 6% hit from gear. That's pretty trivial to get, right? So the only DPS stat that you can get on gear for Shadow Priest is spell power. All right, not too much of a problem, but the spell power coefficients on Shadow Priests are really low. Mind Flay and Mind Blast, both of them together, have like a spell coefficient of around 42 to 45%. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's like a 42% scaling. Now compare this to a Smite Priest, where they do crit. They don't have a crit damage talent like Warlocks do, but you can still crit. You need 16% hit, so you need a lot of hit on gear. And you have a 71% spell coefficient on Smite. So despite the fact, even though the talents surrounding Smite is a lot worse, it's just the fact that you get more from stats on gear compared to a spec like Shadow Priest, because Shadow Priest just gets so much from the talents that you don't need much more from gear.
You are blowing my mind with some of the stuff that I'm sure many listeners knew, but me being obviously the somewhat misinformed casual that I am, didn't know, and that I'm taking heed of because, as many listeners know, I am planning on rolling a priest when Classic comes. I had no idea that, as you say, is it Shadow Word Pain and Mind Flay didn't crit, that it's not possible of critting. That's pretty interesting to note. And you're slowly winning me around to this Smite Priest build.
And here's the other thing that, people often go for, the will buffs when you go into raids. Now, you get a lot of crit from will buffs. Shadow Priests don't do anything with this crit. So, fundamentally, I was playing a Shadow Priest, and I was looking at all these different things that I was getting, and I was like, wow, I wish I could benefit from this, or I wish I could benefit from this. But now, ultimately, Shadow Priest is more of a utility spec. You're there for the shadow weaving, but, it's more fun to kind of also see how far you can push your damage on top of the shadow weaving. And this kind of led me down a rabbit hole of, what other specs are there? Let's try an arcane mage, like a pure arcane missiles mage, which I eventually did play on Nostarius right until the end of Blackwing Lair.
I've got a million questions that have just arisen from everything that you've just said, and you're doing so fantastically well, and you explain yourself so well with your answers. So I'm just going to push you a little bit harder here, if you don't mind. And
Not a problem.
What I'm going to say is, when Keftank came on the show, he suggested that while Smite Priests are a spec that you should perhaps try, that is capable of more than you think, it's still not obviously the greatest thing since sliced bread. What I'm asking is, what is your overall designation for Smite Priests? Is it purely when you're looking to fool around a little bit, or would you say it's actually viable for leveling more than people would consider?
For leveling, absolutely. I actually leveled as a Smite Priest all the way up to 60. So, if you don't mind, I'll just go a little bit into leveling a priest, if
Sure.
That's all right. Sure. Okay. So, I honestly believe that it doesn't matter what you do as a priest as long as you get this one talent, which is Spirit Tap. That's the first tier talent from the Shadow Tree, which I believe it's 100% spirit when you finish, once you kill something. Now,
Yep.
I honestly believe once you have this talent, it doesn't matter what you do. You can go Shadow, you can go Pure Wands, you can go Smite, you can go whatever, because that talent allows you to have such a smooth leveling experience with such little downtime. I actually leveled 1 to 60, both as Shadow and as Holy. And, kind of comparing the two, Shadow was a little better, but I didn't want to do Shadow twice, and I had a lot of fun playing, Pure Smite. It was kind of, pull the monster with Holy Fire and then Smite till it's dead. And, it was a lot of fun because just constantly casting Smite feels like you're just machine gunning a monster down to death before, you move on to the next one. And your mana problems are kind of somewhat solvable when all you need to do is look for gear with a lot of spirit on them and ensure you take Spirit Tap.
Now, I'll ask you this question, and I'm allowed one stupid question per call, so every interviewee knows this. This will be the dumbest question I ask during this call. But what I've always wondered is, with something like Spirit Tap, when you talk about, you put your 5 talents into it and you get that 100% rate, have you ever considered, or has the argument ever been put forward, I'm a bit of a gambler. If I were to put 4 instead of 5 talents into Spirit Tap and just go, you know what, I'm happy with 80%, let's roll the dice and I'll throw that 1 point somewhere else. Have you ever considered something like that, or am I the craziest person alive?
I mean, I think it's justifiable because the chance is pretty high. I think it's 80% at level 4, which is probably fine. It's just, I tend to like having a bit of consistency while leveling, and I don't want to have that moment where I kill a monster and my mana is completely spent and then I just, fail the roll. So I mean, I personally wouldn't do it, but I mean, if you like to gamble, why not? I mean, at the end of the day, it's about having fun while leveling. Like, leveling is not really the place where you need to push yourself to theorycraft to the maximum extreme, right? Like, leveling is kind of, I mean, at the end of the day, a large part of vanilla is the journey to 60. And if you're not having fun while leveling, then kind of what are you doing, right?
Definitely. I definitely agree with that. Now, Thank you so much for making me not feel like too much of an idiot for asking that question, even though a lot of listeners might be laughing at me right now. But hey, I like to mix it up. It's all good. Some food for thought. Now, moving on from that, the concept of theory crafting is something that has always intrigued me, and I've had a lot of amazing theory crafters already on the show. People like Taladrill, people like, Shadow, people like Keftank. It's always the druids, those crazy theory crafters. I love it. But yourself as well. You call yourself, an avid theory crafter, it sounds like, from the work that you've done. Now, even though it's something that I am not made of the right stuff to get involved in theory crafting, numbers and I do not get along. Here's what I'll ask in terms of your theory crafting work. And this is something that I try to ask every theory crafter that comes on the show. Tell me about what kind of testing you did to come up with the figures that you did. And feel free to get as intricate with detail as you'd like.
So that's kind of an interesting question, because I'd say that at the end of the day, when we're theory crafting on an emulated server, we are still kind of theory crafting on, it might be close to the real thing, it might not be. It's honestly been too long since I played vanilla WoW, like the actual game, to know how different certain things are, especially kind of minute details that might be hard to remember back in the day. But to answer your question, a lot of casters in vanilla play very much the same. They share so many mechanics together. In fact, you could very easily make a single spreadsheet that just encompasses every single caster with just, a few differences here and there, and the spreadsheet would kind of cover every single caster spec, so to speak. So I actually did tests with my Shadow Priest a lot, and I spent a lot of gold, respecking and all that, and checking some of the numbers to ensure that the DPS sheet that I put together was actually spitting out the right numbers, because it was like, well, okay, my sheet says I'm doing, say, DPS of 400, and I'm in the game and it's giving me 200. What the hell, But once there was like sort of a reasonable margin of error, it's enough to know that, well, the sheet is kind of simulating combat correctly. And you can kind of test it again, which I did with the second class, which was my mage. And once you do that, it's like, all right, now it's just a matter of math. It's got nothing to do with testing. It's like, once you have the simulation down, it's all comes down to the math and how much, like, the spell coefficient of different skills, the base damage of different skills, the cast time of different skills, how much they cost in terms of mana, how your class's talents interact with those skills. All that's just math, right? So it's easy to, once you understand how those talents are interacting with the skills, you just kind of plug in the numbers, and kind of the sheet will tell you what it's meant to do.
Now, if someone is interested in getting involved in theory crafting, is it basically buckle up and get ready for hours of work hitting a training dummy?
Not necessarily, because there are many aspects of theory crafting that you can just do, like honestly with even no testing, because a lot of the things that you can kind of start. Like, I didn't start by hitting a training dummy a lot of the time. In fact, I finished my sheet before I even touched a training dummy. The only thing I used a training dummy for was to verify the results, if that makes sense. Like, it was, okay, I finished the sheet. Is the sheet actually correct? And then you go verify the results. But you don't actually need to kind of hit the training dummy to learn how the game works. Like, the first step to any theory crafter is to actually understand the underlying mechanics of the game, which is to say, just to give you an example, how this is quite a simple example, but some people may not be aware. But it's very easy to calculate the spell coefficient of a skill. It's just the cast time of the skill divided by 3.5. And that is the spell coefficient of a skill. There are obviously exceptions and there are special cases, but Frostbolt, it has a cast time of 3 seconds, so the spell coefficient is 3 divided by 3.5. Smite, it has a cast time of 2.5 seconds, so the spell coefficient is 2.5 divided by 3.5, and so on and so forth. So it comes down to just, once you have the knowledge of how all the underlying mechanics of the game work, it's very easy to get into theory crafting from there. And then once you start making more and more complicated sheets, complicated calculators, then that's actually when you need to start kind of verifying your results to make sure you're not kind of, kind of chase, kind of on a wild goose chase or something.
Okay, so we've talked about leveling a little bit. Now, just very briefly on perhaps the trials and tribulations of the raiding Smite Priest. Is that something that people should look into?
So here's what I always tell people that ask me about sort of, off specs. And it comes down to, what are you raiding for? Because if you're not raiding, so there are people who just want to raid to kill the bosses. There are people who raid in order to try to get the fastest times possible. They try to compete with each other to try to get the fastest molten core times possible, Blackwing Lair, whatever. And if that's not what you're interested in, then it honestly doesn't matter that much what you're playing. Like, I played vanilla as well when I was, 10, 15 years ago, and half the people in my raid weren't doing anything. They were, half of them were disconnecting, doing whatever. And it doesn't really matter what you're doing. What ends up actually mattering is how much you put into such a spec. You can't just, okay, let's say you pick a Smite Priest and go into a raid, right? You can't just not know about how the spec is going to work and just absentmindedly press a few buttons here and there and expect to do well. If you're playing a spec that is mathematically worse than many of the other specs in the game, it's not the worst thing in the world as long as you put forth the work required to make such a spec work. Smite has some fundamental problems, one of which being it is a mana hog. So you need to farm items such as demonic runes to kind of help your to essentially be able to keep up with some of the other casters who may not have such a problem. But if you're able to do that, then you kind of solved one problem because you don't have mana problems now. I mean, you might still, but I mean, you've obviously lessened your mana problem here, and so on and so forth. It's not even just a Smite Priest. I would say this applies to almost any spec that's not as popular. If you're not trying to go for a world first kill or trying to race to finish Molten Core, it honestly doesn't matter that much, especially for the early raids like Molten Core and Blackwing Lair. I'd probably go as far as to say you can take virtually any spec into these raids, and as long as you're a competent player who understands how that spec works, you can probably make it work fine. Okay,
so if I were to say to you, gun to your head, proverbially, of course, and I made you sweat on this decision in one word, what would you say when I ask you, if I am leveling as a priest in Classic, and let's presume just for shits and giggles that the private server data is what we're going to get, even though that might not be the case, just going by what we know. If I'm leveling from 1 to 60 as a priest and I'm gearing in a way that complements that spec, which will have me burning down mobs quicker and getting to 60 faster, Shadow or Smite Priest?
I would say Shadow, but I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that big of a difference.
Very good to know. Okay. Now, you mentioned that keyword of mage a couple of minutes ago in one of your fantastic answers, and thank you so much. You're being so incredibly intricate in your responses, and I really do appreciate it, and I'm sure a lot of listeners are enjoying this chat. So you have done some work on arcane mages as well as priests, haven't you?
So I always remembered from my childhood that I used to see a lot of mages cast arcane missiles, and I was always, and I mean, once you look at the numbers and why arcane missiles isn't really used in a raiding, like in raids or whatever, you kind of understand why. But I was still curious to know, how much could you push it? Like, how bad actually is it? And the answer is, it is worse than a frost mage. There is no questions about it. And just to clarify, when I say an arcane mage, I'm not talking about an arcane frost mage, like a mage that takes 31 points in the arcane tree and then casts frostbolt. I'm talking about a mage that casts arcane missiles. And the answer is, it is worse than frost. It's not that much worse than frost, and it plays very differently. And it's kind of an interesting change of pace because frankly, playing a mage can get very boring in raids because you're just spamming frostbolt for the rest of your life, and just having some variance in your routine can be really fun. And I actually had a lot of fun researching all the things that an arcane mage could do, and there were a few actually interesting items that I came across which work really well with an arcane mage. I mean, I'm not entirely sure if it would work this way on Classic, but since we obviously don't know yet. But as an example, there is this item called Wrath of Cenarius that comes from the pre-AQ patch, I believe. And what it does is it gives you a spell. It gives you, I believe, it's 132 spell damage when your spells hit an enemy. Now, arcane missiles hits an enemy once every second, whereas all the other, like Frostbolt, hits an enemy once every 2.5 seconds. So just by going by those numbers, you have a much higher uptime on this spell damage buff with the Wrath of Cenarius compared to a Frost Mage. Similarly, although this is more theoretical than anything, but there is the Naxxramas set, the T6 bonus, has a thing which says when your spells hit an enemy, they have a chance to take an additional 200 damage from spells. The proc chance of this is 20%. Now, if you're hitting the monster, if you're hitting the boss once every second, the uptime on such a debuff is a lot higher as an arcane mage. I'm curious to know how quote unquote support mage would work as arcane with this T6 bonus, but sadly Nostalgia shut down before I could actually try it out and see how it worked in practice.
Okay, now I'm sorry to do this to you, but again, you said many, many things that have given rise to a couple of questions there. So the first thing I want to ask is, you said at the outset of that answer that Arcane Mage is actually not that much worse than Frost Mage. Now, I'm sure there might be some mages listening to this very conversation who might feel slightly triggered by that, going, what? That's outrageous to say. But you've done the work, and so the question is, when you say it's not that much worse, let's put it in, say, percentages. What would you say in terms of, if I said, tell me, is it 5%, 10%, 15%, and why? How much better is Frost than Arcane?
So I actually have that on my sheet at the moment. Let me take a look and I'll tell you.
Sure.
In a second.
And while you're looking that up, I'm just going to basically comment over the top of this, is that you mentioned the one thing that has kept me away from mages this whole time. I would love to play a mage. They've always intrigued me. Here's the two things about mages that I dislike. I hate downtime, and I hate the concept of getting to high level and then spamming one button. I am the kind of person that wants to have my brain massaged, if you will, by a very nice rotation. Not something too complex because I'm a noob, but just something more than one button. And if you're suggesting that Arcane might actually be a build that allows you that kind of flexibility and gets away from the Frostbolt, more Frostbolt kind of generic thing that we throw on Frost Mages, then that's something that might actually intrigue me if it's not that much more worse off than Frost.
So, just to clarify, it's not that Arcane is any less boring, because Arcane Mage is also just arcane missiles.
Ah.
But essentially, it still feels different if you're just doing something different from week 1 to week 2. It's not so. In general, I'm probably going to say that any caster really in vanilla is probably going to have a boring rotation. Like there are very few casters that don't have a rotation that's not boring. Like mages are going to spam Frostbolt, warlocks are going to spam Shadowbolt, boomkins are going to spam Starfire, shamans are going to spam Lightning Bolt. It's kind of how vanilla is set up, especially when it comes to casters. Interesting rotations are more like in the face of melee, because they actually have a few different, they actually have a few more things to care about. But casters are really just mana management and spamming your most efficient spell. Now, to answer the other question about the Arcane thing, so just to clarify, Arcane also scales a lot worse than Frost, because Arcane does not have a crit damage talent, which Frost does, and there are a few other things, like there is like a talent that Frost has that makes it a little better. But my statement was more, it was worse, but I mean, it's not that much worse. It was like a 20%, like I had a 20% DPS loss when I moved over to arcane, but my gear wasn't obviously, perfect for arcane. It was just my frost gear that I just was like, all right, let's put down arcane mages and see how it goes. And it was like a 20% loss, but does that matter really? I mean, we were already killing bosses with one hand tied behind their back. So it was like, all right, I'm going to try this and it's going to be fun. And I played it for weeks before I got tired of that. But like I said, I think the most intriguing part of an arcane mage comes with a lot of the future gear that I never actually got to experience myself because Nostalria shut down before a lot of them came into the game. But I'd actually be really intrigued to see how support mage with the Naxxramas set would do, because you would constantly have a debuff on bosses that makes them take 200 increased spell damage, which would kind of boost your other warlocks and mages at the same time while you kind of give up your own DPS for raid DPS. Now, I suspect it's probably not worth the DPS loss, but it's still fun to kind of think about and see, how far you could push such a concept.
Well, I love the work that you're doing. I love that you've put a bit of a focus on arcane mages through your theory crafting. And one of my greatest hopes for Classic, and I'm sure many listeners feel the same way, and yourself as well, is that I hope and pray that we are going to get specs basically risen from the dead in Classic when we get the proper values and everything put into the Blizz-like experience. And then we start, with theory crafters like yourself crunching the numbers and going, holy shit, arcane mages can actually do something. Because I've said on the show before, I just feel that, and this is just an observance from going through forums and YouTube videos and everything, I really think that arcane mage is the least spoken about spec in the game. Would you agree with that somewhat?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. And frankly, it's not surprising because the way the talent trees are set up, all the talents in the arcane tree don't actually benefit arcane spells. It just benefits all spells. So there's very little reason to use arcane over frost when you can take all the talents in the arcane tree, but then kind of put it towards your frost bolts. So the other thing I'd like to say, essentially about specs, is a lot of the vanilla kind of preconceived notions that people have, there's also another thing to consider. So when I originally played vanilla, I stopped playing vanilla after my guild killed Nefarian. So it was basically after Blackwing Lair. Now, when I started playing Nostalrius, the talents that I saw in Nostalrius were completely different to the ones that I used back then. And the answer was there were a number of class revamps throughout the lifetime of vanilla. In fact, there was certain pieces of gear, like the Paladin T2 set, that got revamped a total of 3 times, I believe, throughout the game. So, for example, a lot of people will often say that druids cannot tank. And a lot of people's notions come from the early version of druids, like the release of vanilla druids, when druids maybe actually couldn't tank then. But as the classes all got revamped one after the other in vanilla, and we reached the end of vanilla's life cycle, a lot of those specs that people earlier considered were just not good had been fixed, but because people had already started with those notions of, well, it's only this class can, it's only a warrior that can tank, or it's only, spec A or spec B that can do things. But now that we know that Classic is going to start with the patch 1.12, I feel like many of those notions need to be re-examined and to see that, wait, do those notions actually hold up in a patch 1.12 environment rather than in the patch that people were used to playing? Which, quite frankly, when I started playing Nostalrius, I was like, what are these talents? I mean, it's not like I didn't know that the talents had gotten changed or anything, but it was more, they felt very different to me compared to when I played back in vanilla and compared to what they were like on Nostalrius.
Just change tact a little bit here. Thank you so much for all of that information. I'm sure a lot of listeners enjoyed that as much as I did. And it's become blatantly obvious as you went through all of those answers that you are one of those people who I shout out on the show occasionally who have clearly probably forgotten more about vanilla than I've ever learned. So I really do appreciate someone as informed as you coming on and sharing your work with us. But just to change, basically topics a little bit here, you also mentioned to me that you are a game developer. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, and you work on a game, we won't say the name, we won't say the studio, but you work on a game that most people listening here would probably have heard of. Is that right?
Probably, I'd say that. I'd say so.
Okay. Now, your role is a game designer. So with your experience, well, first I should say, how long have you worked in the industry?
A little over 2 years, I believe. Yes, a little over 2 years.
Okay, so in the 2 years of experience that you've had so far, appreciating that you're somewhat of a baby in the industry, but I'm sure you've seen and heard and learnt a lot of stuff. And it's amazing now knowing that, at the outset of your career, you're working on the game that you are, which, as I say, is a fantastic achievement. But knowing the role that you're basically working at the moment as a game designer, we'll tell people firstly, is there something that you, through your experience, would have done with World of Warcraft, knowing what you know now about game design?
This isn't even something related to what I know today, but even something that always used to kind of bother me back when I played World of Warcraft as well.
Sure.
So I actually started playing World of Warcraft with a group of friends from a previous MMO. And one thing that always used to bother me this wasn't so much of a concern at the early days of vanilla, but this became more and more of a problem as the patches went on. And it was how, for lack of a better word, how boring itemization was. Now, to try to explain that a little better, what I mean is, in the early patches of vanilla, we always had a lot of these kind of really quirky items that did things that were a lot harder to quantify in terms of stats. For example, there's this item called Hand of Edward the Odd that on hit, I believe it's on hit, like a chance on hit to make your next spell cast instantly. And it's just interesting procs like that were just missing from a lot of the later raid tiers and later pieces of gear. It just ended up being more and more of the like stat A, stat B, stat C. And I mean, of course, we had the tier sets, but outside of that, most pieces of gear just kind of ended up being a bit, like I said, boring. And the one thing I feel would have made a much better game was just kind of sprucing up the itemization a bit, make it harder to know what the best gear is. Because right now it's really easy to math out what the best set of gear is for any given spec. But if it's a lot harder to do this, that would kind of allow a lot more theory crafting to go into a lot of these specs because sometimes it's not an easy math problem. It's a very hard math problem sometimes.
So talking about itemization, if that's something that you've singled out as a little bit of a bugaboo for you and something that you personally would have loved to tinker with had you been given the reins to World of Warcraft, and knowing that you mentioned that proc and you wish that they had done a bit more with that, not to put you on the spot too much, but have you ever thought about something like a proc that you personally would love to have seen put in the game? And perhaps I'll just ask, if you were to design a new proc for World of Warcraft, what kind of wacky things would you tinker with?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I have the perfect answer right away, but just off the top of my head, so there used to be So there was this item back in, I believe it got released in the Blackwing Lair patch called it's essentially the Blue Dragon Darkmoon card, which essentially has a proc on successful spellcast to recover mana. I think what it does is it has a proc that lasts 15 seconds that makes you regenerate mana as though you were out of combat. Now, I feel like caster itemization would have been a lot better if we had more procs on essentially, like just a random example off the top of my head, but if there was a trinket that essentially had a chance when your spells hit a boss to essentially deal X% of like a bunch of additional damage based on your maximum mana pool. Like that would be pretty interesting because now your character is now trying to maximize that proc and also changing how you build your character by making your mana pool as high as it could be, just in order to ensure that you were able to deal the just in order to maximize the damage of the proc.
I would love to see a proc in the game that, let's put it on the last boss in, Sunken Temple or something that has people going to Sunken Temple more often. I want to see a proc, and this would be a change, but fuck it, we're going crazy here, that blocks out gold selling messages for 1 hour within the game. What do you reckon?
That sounds great.
Okay, so what else are the kind of things that, if I were to ask, if I'm, let's say I'm Mike Morhaime and I come to you, Deathlace, and I say, hey, buddy, I've seen you work. I love it. Come on board with classic World of Warcraft. And you know what? Changes abound. You do what you like. What's your number one thing with the design of the game that you would tinker with?
Itemization. Again, so, not to repeat it again, but I definitely feel like that's one of the weakest points of the game. And it's not like it got any better with later expansions. In fact, I would say that problem has probably been magnified even to this day. And I definitely feel like that's kind of a baseline problem that if it was fixed, I feel like it would lead to a better game. Of course, we're not actually playing Classic WoW with changes, because then we're not going back to the game that we grew up with. But hypotheticals and all that. I honestly feel the first thing to actually look at would be the itemization of the game.
Now, one thing I might ask you, if you're okay with just covering a very simple topic a little bit generally, with itemization being, as you say, a little bit of a pet peeve for you. The whole podcast, part of the reason the podcast was started was basically when Classic was announced, I took it on as a bit of a project for the re-education of Josh Corbett about World of Warcraft vanilla, because I've forgotten everything. And I thought if I start a podcast, I can, maybe just jog my memory and find out everything again. And trust me, I'm learning. It's fantastic. So what I would ask you, and I hear this come up all the time, is now that we know that 1.12 will be the foundation that we're getting with Classic, whatever that means, people are now debating about, will we get 1.12 itemization or won't we? And the fallout from that is some people are saying, if we get 1.12 itemization, then if they don't retune dungeons, it will turn them into laughable runs. So my question is, and I sort of know the answer, but I want an absolute pro to explain it to me. Why is it that 1.12 itemization is such a prickly issue? So
honestly, I don't envy their position, because it's a hard decision to make one way or the other. So the problem with 1.12 itemization is Blizzard went back and added a number of kind of catch-up gear to a lot of the earlier dungeons. Now, as it turns out, a lot of that catch-up gear is better than gear from Molten Core. Now, let's say we were to remove that gear from the older dungeons, such that you're now dealing with the oldest itemization, and you don't have the newer, the thing. Like a good example is the caster helmet that was added to the end of the UBRS boss, Spellweaver's Turban, which is basically probably one of the best pieces of gear you can get for a very long time. But on the flip side, how much does it actually kind of solve things? Like, okay, you roll items back to their pre 1.12 state and you add them to the game, but it's not like, but people know what it's going to change into, so it's not like there's any what's the word I'm looking for here? There's not like any real wonder or anything. People are gonna pick up items knowing what they're going to change into, rather than just picking up items as they are, because they know that the items are going to change. A great example of this is the orb that you get from the end of the Zelda quest, the Spirit of Aquamentas. And originally what the item did was it reduced the mana cost of your spells by 25. So if you used a level 1 healing spell and you use that, you would reduce it down to 0. Now, that was changed in 1.3 to have I believe it's just 20% spell damage in 1.3. But there are examples of like really, so we're not going all the way back to 1.2 then. Do we stop at 1.3? Like there are, and like I mentioned a little bit earlier in the podcast, the Paladin set, I believe the T2 set changed, I think, a total of 3 times throughout Vanilla's lifetime. Which part are we going to go with? Are we going to go with the first part, the second part, the third part, or are we going to go through all 3 as we go towards next round? So it's a really hard question, and I have no idea how they're meant to solve it. Like, again, probably the best way taking all things into account is to just refactor all the dungeons and raids to kind of readjust them to the new itemization. But then you still have the problem of dungeon gear just being better than gear from Molten Core and in some cases Blackwing Lair. So I really don't envy this decision because I really don't envy them this decision because I don't know how best to solve it.
Well, thank you so much for explaining that to me. I say I'm allowed 1 stupid question per podcast. I extended it out to 2, so thank you so much for humoring me. Your answer was fantastic. Deathlace, thank you so much. You signed up for a 15-minute chat. You were so unbelievable that I extended it out. We've been talking for over 40 minutes now. I cannot thank you enough. You've been fantastic. I would love to have you back on the show another time. If listeners have enjoyed this, which I'm sure they have, I'm sure they'll hit me up to get you back on the show another time. So let me just say thank you so much and thanks for calling.
You're welcome. And yeah, it was really fun, and I'd be happy to come back again sometime and talk about more random vanilla stuff.
And that's the end of that mini interview, and thanks so much again to Deathlace for not uttering a word of protest as I dragged that call out for all it was worth and had him on the line for about 45 minutes. But as you heard, he's clearly a very interesting and knowledgeable figure in the industry, and I will absolutely push for some more appearances from him on the show if he's game. But for now, that's today's show, everyone. But just before you go, I want to shout out to the members of the Countdown Council, whom I call every week for input on where the show should head in the week to come. So shout out to Borzen, Raidmar, Camp Sowen, Palfurus, Permadrunk, Rarebit, Seven Winters, Tsunami, The Anton, Wilson Mar, and Volarko. Thank you so much for your phenomenal support of the show. Countdown to Classic would not be the same without your support. And also, a big thank you to supporters Hurlbert, Good Kisser, Myrtle Banks, and Purgatos81 as always. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. I shall see you again on Wednesday for an interview all about twinking and another couple of great shorter calls, as we'll talk about the similarities between World of Warcraft and Magic the Gathering, as well as part 1 of introducing your loved ones to Azeroth. I look forward to seeing you all then. Have a great day.